All right, guys, so we have the 41-page motion to set aside the verdict filed by Jonathan Major's defense team. We're going to do a full reading of it. We're also going to do a summary reading of it if you just want the quick details right at the beginning from Business Insider. So shout out to, if you guys are familiar with Business Insider and their coverage of the Jonathan Majors case, it's really been Laura Taliano doing great work. She's the one that obtained this motion that we're going to be looking at. And then shout out to One Shot Mac, because he's the one that pointed out that this article came out and this motion is now available for us to read. So let's get right into it. I will be checking your comments. And Eliza, we're reading the motion. We're going to see what it actually says, because yesterday we were just speculating. But I will read everyone's comments. I just want to make sure we get the facts right in the front of this video. So, from Business Insider, Jonathan Majors sentence, Marvel actor asked judge to void domestic violence conviction, citing judicial error, insufficiency of evidence. So, we're going to see some stuff about the judge, and the judge has to make the decision on this, at least at this level, since it goes to him. Jonathan Majors' 41-page motion to void his December domestic violence conviction was made public Wednesday, and it cites judicial error and insufficiency of evidence as grounds. It's a statistical long shot for the Marvel actor, which is true, as this kind of pre-sentencing effort, known as a 330-30 motion in reference to New York State criminal procedure law, rarely succeeds. But its filing, which was obtained by Business Insider, shows Majors is aggressively challenging the career-crushing misdemeanor conviction. The actor faces up to 1 year in city jail at a sentencing set for April 8th. A Manhattan jury convicted Majors on December 18th of misdemeanor reckless assault charges and a lower-level charge of harassment. These charges stemmed from a midnight fight last March on the streets of Chinatown with then-girlfriend Grace Jabari. Majors, after they saw a play, right? So if you guys didn't hear that yesterday, let me say this at the front of this video. The play that they saw on March 24th, the plot of the play was an interracial couple. They break up, white girlfriend, black boyfriend. They break up. The boyfriend breaks up with Gloria, the girlfriend, because she wasn't who she said she was. She was actually a prostitute that didn't meet his standards, so he went his separate ways. She couldn't cope with that. She sent people to go look for him. He wouldn't come back. They couldn't find him. So ultimately, she ends up unaliving herself. That's the plot of the play in short. We discussed it in detail on our streams yesterday, but I think it's really important, anyone reading the beginning of this video, to understand the context of the play they saw the night before this all unfolds. Moving on with the reading there. But they're citing a reversible judicial error relating to the reckless assault and a lack of sufficient evidence concerning that charge and the harassment violation. The reckless demeanor assault, so they're going to go into details here. The jury in December acquitted Majors of the original charge of intentional assault, and it's on this point that Majors' attorney, Priya Chaudhry, focuses her 330-30 effort. She argues that Judge Michael Gaffey improperly, and over defense objections, gave jurors an alternate choice of finding Majors assaulted Jabari recklessly or intentionally. Prosecutors contended throughout the trial that Majors' assault on Jabari was intentional. By offering jurors an alternative of reckless assault, the judge improperly gave prosecutors a second bite at the apple. Oops, Chaudhry wrote. Prosecutors presented an intentional or bust assault case, but no evidence that the assault could have been unintentional or reckless, she wrote. And for that reason, the reckless assault charge should never have been presented to the jury at all. And again, they're noting that this was objected to, so it was preserved. And guys, if we stop here, if this pre-sentencing post-conviction mechanism doesn't work, we're going to see this again on appeal. So don't think it ends here just because the judge has to look at criticisms of himself. The next point, neither eyewitness describes recklessness. There were only 2 witnesses to the couple's physical fight inside a moving Cadillac Escalade, Chaudhry reasoned in the filing, their chauffeur and Jabari herself. Neither describes a reckless assault in their testimony, the motion argues. Instead, Jabari, quote, this is directly from the motion, the memorandum for the motion, gave testimony that, if credited, support only that Mr. Majors physically assaulted her and caused these 2 specific injuries with the unambiguous, so no discretion, absolutely intentionally, to cause her physical injury, meaning a cut to her ear and a broken finger. Majors was, quote, just trying to make me feel pain. So trying is intent. And remember, guys, all of you in the chat who went through those transcript readings with us all together, we pointed out, like, she's purposely using this language to make it seem like there was intent. And now Chaudhry's calling it out as problematic because the jury only found reckless assault, which doesn't match her testimony that it was intentional. Jabari testified on direct examination, describing Majors twisting her right arm behind her back in the car during a tussle over the actor's cell phone. I felt pressure on my hand, like he was just trying to hurt me. On cross-examination, she continued to describe an intentional attack. It felt like he was trying to make me react, she told jurors. Trying. He was trying to make me feel pain. The chauffeur, meanwhile, testified that Mr. Majors did not assault Miss Jabari in the Escalade in which they were riding, and indeed that it was she who assaulted Mr. Majors, Chaudhry wrote. What did you see the defendant do? The chauffeur, Naveed Sarwar, was asked on the stand. He was not doing anything. She was doing everything, the chauffeur answered. Because neither eyewitness described recklessness, the conviction on the charge of reckless misdemeanor assault is unsupported. So that's insufficiency of the evidence right there. That's the underlying legal argument there. Prosecutors presented scant evidence bookended by pattern of abuse claims. Chaudhry also argues that rather than provide sufficient evidence of any assault, prosecutors instead offered jurors claims about Majors' quote, pattern of abusing his ex-girlfriend that proved nothing about what happened during the dispute itself. That evidence included damaging testimony that Majors told Jabari she needed to act like Michelle Obama and Coretta Scott King and make sacrifices for him. Majors, well, he said us, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but didn't he say us? He wasn't like, you need to do this for me. Majors has, but shout out to Laura Italiano anyway. That's something like you're typing fast, maybe you're not thinking about it. That's a little, I want to correct it for the people watching the stream though. Majors has maintained that he was the victim, not the aggressor of his fight with Jabari, and his defense had argued at trial that surveillance camera footage from a bar and sidewalk prove her injuries. The broken finger and the cut on her ear were caused when she fell hours drinking later while alone in his apartment. Now again, right here, this paragraph describes what they argued at trial. The people bookended the trial with loud accusations of a deliberate pattern of intentional bad conduct by Mr. Majors, Chaudhry wrote. They relentlessly pressured a narrative of deliberate and calculated abuse, she wrote. Prosecutors have until March 5th to respond to the 33030, and his lawyers have until March 12th to respond to that response. Now, so far, we as a matter of public record, don't have the documents that the prosecution has filed in response to motions filed by Priya Chaudhry. So if we'll be able to see that, if they go with the same practice, probably not. If maybe their response doesn't include things that references stuff they don't want to make a ruling on, if it's unsealed, maybe we'll get that. But I'm just saying I wouldn't expect on March 5th to get a PDF in our hands. And likewise, if we can't see this, we probably won't get to see the response to the response. A spokesperson for Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg said, the court has already heard and rejected the arguments supporting this motion when the defense originally raised them during the trial. The jury then convicted Mr. Majors of assault in the 3rd degree and harassment in the 2nd degree. We will respond in court papers. So there's that. Let's roll up if you guys got some comments going on here. So I see Eliza's here. SCW Chrisman, hey, no problem for doing this. And again, shout out to One Shot Mac, because he's the one that was like, hey, let's get some eyes. Business Insider has this article published here. And then let's see. So we've got Juanita. Yeah, they're bringing up the jail time again. And listen, I need to just share my thoughts on that. I don't think it's irrelevant to report on jail time because it's something that's within the limits of the sentencing, and I think the prosecution will absolutely go for it. But it's annoying that because this is going to take more months, that means for months we're just going to have Jonathan Majors' name associated with jail, prison, sentencing, like these types of just bad connotations. And then Tracker, yep, the judicial misconduct in the judge bedroom. He didn't walk through the bedroom. And then her parents coached the hell out of her. Yep, and I think that's a great point. So where Chaudhry's arguing, and we'll get to the actual reading of the motion, but we're obviously going to see her make this argument that, hey, Jabari kept saying these things. And even when Danny was sitting in the courtroom, Danny jumped on a live stream to say what happened in court. And she was like, she keeps getting asked these questions and her answers just seem to not be so great. So on direct, when the prosecution's trying to say that he caused you pain, right? Because the prosecution needs to prove that the mechanism of injury was inflicted by Jonathan Majors and that pain was inflicted and that it was an obstacle to her having motion of the part that was injured. She was like, no, I didn't feel anything. It was just shock and adrenaline. And the prosecution keeps asking her, but did you feel pain at all? Any pain? Please say the word pain. And she's just like, no pain at all, because she probably didn't want to ruin why she was out at the club. She didn't want to give people an excuse to be like, well, if you felt so much pain, then why did you go out? But then on the flip side, when the defense is asking her questions about what happened in the car or cars, she made a point of driving home. He was trying to make me feel pain, trying. I know he was. I didn't even look at him, but I just knew. I just felt he was trying to make me feel pain. And that stuff's going to come back to bite her because the prosecution's argument was intent, at least to start. It unraveled a bit at the end of trial, especially approaching closing arguments and jury instructions, which is going to be a center point of the motion that we're going to look at. And then, hey, Big Will, gang bang. And then, no, he was not found guilty. That's what I believe. And then here we go, another 8. Yeah, hopefully this isn't 8 hours. It's only 41 pages. Buzzwords for the clicks. Was the spokesman even there? Because I don't think they made any motion or brought up a motion during closing arguments. At least I don't recall. I don't know. And then testimonial word salad answers. Juanita says, it's to normalize the association so there's no questions when they give him the egregious sentence. I agree. That's very valid. That's a good point. And then Arbico shows she pushed the limits. Textbook on stand answering. If she were the aggressor and on stand for assault, they would have said she was a hostile witness. Yep. So let's get over to this whopper. Now, I do want to note, so this is obviously like the cover. It's the memorandum in support of defense motion to set aside the verdict. So they probably filed, hey, we're filing this motion. They probably said that on Monday. Remember yesterday we were talking about, well, they did something in court on Monday morning and then they came in Tuesday morning and filed more motions. They might have filed the motion and then brought the memorandum yesterday, this 41-page documents to support the motion. So that's probably what happened. We do have a name here that I didn't see. It's Awais, Arshad, I don't know. You can make fun of how I pronounce names. I don't want to get it wrong though. But the other 3 were all part of the motion to dismiss filing. But this is a new name for me. I did look him up really quickly. He is part of the Chaudhry law firm. So, but he's a new person on for this motion. This is just an index. This helps structure the argument and make it really easy to reference for a response or any oral arguments about it. We don't need to look at that. And then this is going to be all the authorities. So anything that has, case precedent that could be relevant to the arguments that are going to be made here. And then the statutes that they're going to talk about. So we looked at these 3 yesterday, the ones that relate to how this motion works and what happens if it's granted. And then we're going to see all these other penal codes referenced. If we need to, I can stop and pull up what they actually mean, but we're going to try to just get through this reading if we don't need to do that. And then let's see. And then, hey, Lauren. So Lauren Victoria Burke is saying Arshad is on Priya's staff and was in the courtroom. All right, awesome. So we got details. So we know Seth was there. We know Priya was there. And then Arshad was sitting there too, all collecting details. And this is at least the first motion we're going to get to see of kind of the arguments they're going to weave together. Again, if this doesn't succeed, and chances are, not a high probability that it will, it's the judge, Gaffey, looking at this. And one of the arguments is about him kind of having judicial overreach. So odds are low. But we'll see the same argument build up and become bigger for an appellate argument. So those are the big names that we're going to keep seeing, I think, these 4 here. And then if we get right into it, so the jury convicted Jonathan Majors of 2 counts, 1 misdemeanor with a reckless state of mind and 1 violation. And we already have a footnote here. So the footnote says, as the court is aware, Mr. Majors was acquitted of both charges, which required an intent to injure, intentional assault, and aggravated harassment. So Priya's making this footnote for the people in the back. Neither charge was supported by the evidence at trial. Moreover, the people presented an intentional or bust assault case, and for that reason, the reckless assault charge should never have been presented to the jury at all. As set forth below, this court must now set aside both verdicts and enter judgment of acquittal for Mr. Majors. This trial was about two events. One, what happened inside the Cadillac Escalade, where the people alleged that Mr. Majors assaulted Grace Jabari. We're going to call that Car 1. And two, what happened outside the Escalade, where the people alleged that Mr. Majors harassed Miss Jabari when he picked her up and placed her back in the car. We're going to call that the car escape. And we have a footnote. During the trial, the parties came to call the events that took place inside the Escalade while it was stopped on the corner of Canal and Center Streets, Car 1, and that term is adopted here. Further, because undisputed testimony established that Mr. Majors asked the driver to stop the car, open the door, exited the car, and put Miss Jabari back into the car specifically in order to get away from her after she followed him, these events are referred to here as the car escape. So now we're getting a new, we've gone with Car 1, Car 2, Car 3. But now we're getting car escape to refer to after that door opens when the car stopped, basically when that surveillance video starts. That is going to be referenced as car escape, distinct from Car 1, because the prosecution says the injuries happened one at this time in Car 1 and one during car escape. So we're going to hammer into that, I think. So there were two people other than Mr. Majors present for these events. Those two witnesses, and only those two witnesses, testified about the events. The assault charges, Car 1, so assault is where the finger's supposed to have happened, were premised on two injuries. The ear's here too. A cut behind right ear and broke. See, that's why I was confused when we were talking about jury instructions and looking at the charges. So let's get through this. The assault charges, Car 1, were premised on the cut behind the right ear and the broken finger. One witness, the driver, Naveed Sarwar, testified that Mr. Majors did not assault Miss Jabari in the Escalade in which they were riding, and indeed that it was she who assaulted Mr. Majors. The other witness, Miss Jabari herself, gave testimony that, if credited, supported only that Mr. Majors physically assaulted her and caused these two specific injuries with the unambiguous intent to cause her physical injury, which he was acquitted of. Regarding the car escape, both witnesses testified that after Mr. Majors and Miss Jabari exited the SUV, and while Mr. Majors and Miss Jabari were on the street next to the SUV, he picked her up and placed her back inside the vehicle a few seconds later. Both also testified, unambiguously, that he did so to get away from Miss Jabari, and that testimony was corroborated by the only other piece of evidence on the harassment charge, a surveillance video depicting Mr. Majors immediately running from Miss Jabari. So, let's see. I want to make sure I'm not... Okay, so we got Winkler in there too, carrying lots of boxes out there. And then that's okay, Artemis. You're here. This is right in the beginning of the motion reading. And yeah, Tracker's saying good verbiage and drilling down on the charges not fitting the actual facts right away. So if a lazy person comes in here and just wants to read page 1 or 2, you pick up all the important pieces right away. And then in short, while the two eyewitnesses testified consistently about what happened outside the SUV, the car escape, they diverged sharply about what happened inside Car 1, with Miss Jabari attesting that Mr. Majors intentionally assaulted her, and the driver that Mr. Majors did not assault her at all. Period. Because all of the evidence on the assault charges fell into one of these two categories and none into a middle ground, the defense asked that the court refrain from submitting to the jury the reckless assault count in addition to the intentional assault count, as these two theories were inconsistent with one another, and there was no evidence of recklessness. Whew. The defense argued, in other words, that allowing the jury to consider a lesser charge that did not require intent would give the people an improper and unwarranted second bite at the apple, and that's in quotes. There's going to be, I'm sure they are going to bring in a bunch of case law about this. Did I miss a footnote? I just want to make sure I didn't miss a footnote. I see one here. When we get to the end of the page, we'll make sure I didn't miss that. Precisely because the people had contended, quite literally at every stage of the trial, that Mr. Majors acted intentionally. In fact, the people bookended the trial with loud accusations of a deliberate pattern of intentional bad conduct by Mr. Majors. In their opening, they stated that, from early in the relationship, Mr. Majors began a pattern of controlling Miss Jabari, withholding affection, and threats of self-harm. In closing, they argued that the whole case hinged on 4 words. And we got this quote from the news reports: control, domination, manipulation, and abuse. And at all points in between, they relentlessly pressed a narrative of deliberate and calculated abuse, including by putting a social worker on the stand to testify about, quote, the cycle of domestic violence and, quote, power and control dynamics between victim and abuser in the context of Mr. Major's, quote, prior acts of control and emotional abuse. Cool, so that's the footnote right there. So, cool. So Exhibit A, people's request to allow expert testimony. Sweet. I don't think we have an appendice in here, but I mean, we can kind of guess. It probably says something like, we're requesting to allow this expert. This is their credentials. This is why we want to have her come and speak to the jury. Indeed, the people decried that the relevance of the history of the relationship between Mr. Majors and Ms. Jabari hinged on demonstrating a, quote, pattern, and to show Mr. Majors' intent on March 25th, 2023. Put another way, the people put on their social worker, quote, expert, and the prior history of Mr. Majors and Ms. Jabari's relationship precisely, and only, they claim, to show Mr. Majors' state of mind, to prove that Mr. Majors acted intentionally on March 25th, 2023. Interesting. So, not once during trial or even leading up to it. Did the people ever suggest that the pattern or history would support a finding that Mr. Majors acted recklessly? That's actually really good because that means that's preserved in, we're not just going off, an opening or closing statement. We're not just going off Grace Jabari's a few bits of her testimony. They're actually arguing this in their request to allow expert testimony from this witness. Thumbs up to catching that detail and including it. Even so, the court denied the defense's application to only submit the intentional assault count to the jury, citing the inapplicable case of People v. Moore. So that's a reference to case law and why it should come in. And noting that there had been a substantial amount of testimony about pulling, twisting, struggling, and grabbing in the back of the Escalade. So they're saying that probably in this case probably involved these motions, and something about it was considered reckless. The jury ultimately acquitted Mr. Majors of intentional assault, but convicted him of reckless assault. In submitting both assault counts to the jury, the court committed reversible error. So reversible error means if this is granted on this ground, the conviction can be overturned and it'll go back to retrial. A careful analysis of the trial record shows that there is quite simply no evidence that Mr. Majors acted recklessly, as opposed to intentionally or not at all, let alone enough such evidence to support a verdict beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Majors committed reckless assault. As discussed below, reckless assault is a lesser included offense of intentional assault, which means that for both counts to be properly submitted to the jury, there must have been some minimum quantity of evidence produced at trial that would support a conviction of reckless assault as distinct from intentional assault. It is not enough that there was room for the jury to speculate that reckless conduct may have occurred. It is not enough for there to be evidence of intentional assault. That is not quite enough to convict on, but is sufficient to cause a generalized feeling that something probably happened. It is not even enough that there was testimony about pulling, twisting, struggling, grabbing, or all four, if all of that testimony described intentional and not reckless acts. For a lesser included offense to be submitted to the jury, the law is clear that there must not only be enough evidence in the record to support a reasonable view that it occurred, there must also be an identifiable rational basis for crediting that evidence while at the same time rejecting the evidence that would support the greater offense. In this case, the people's evidence did not come close to satisfying even the first of those hurdles, because there was in fact no evidence of recklessness, as the penal law defines it. In other words, that Mr. Majors consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk of injuring Ms. Jabari in a gross departure of what a reasonable person would do. The evidence simply was not there. Yet even if it had been, the people also did not clear the second hurdle. They presented an unequivocal case of alleged intentional assault, and the jury, by acquitting Mr. Majors of intentional assault, rejected it. There could not be any identifiable rational basis for the jury to credit some parts of Ms. Jabari's testimony and disregard others in a way that supports a reckless assault conviction, because Ms. Jabari did not provide any testimony besides that which the jury rejected. The reckless assault conviction could only have been based on speculation and is unsupported by the evidence. And in a similar vein, the evidence presented to the jury was unequivocally legally insufficient to support the harassment conviction. Mr. Majors therefore respectfully requests that this court set aside the jury's guilty verdicts and enter judgments of acquittal for 2 reasons. First, because the court erred in presenting 2 inconsistent assault counts to the jury, and second, because the reckless assault and harassment convictions are legally insufficient. I think it's solid, but I don't think the judge is going to care, personally. Let's see what you guys are saying so far, and we can get into the background. With the background, we're going to hear a lot of the same details, but maybe we'll get little parts that are new, so you guys will keep your eyes peeled, I'm sure. So let's see. So Michael Sanchez, the assault is him picking her up and throwing her into the SUV. So what in the initial complaint, and then what actually came forward and through the trial that the prosecution was saying, and it's on the jury instructions. The assault is supposed to be considered for what happened in the car with the finger and then the ear laceration. The harassment charges were supposed to relate to what happened basically as soon as they're getting into that door frame of the car, stepping out, and then he's putting her back in. That's where they're supposed to consider the harassment charges for just the shoving motion. That doesn't mean that the jury looked at it that way, but that's really what they're supposed to do, and it's good to know the distinction, because if that's what the prosecution put forth, the evidence can't just, we think some harassment happened at some point. For the sake of this motion, evidence regarding what happened in car 1 needs to have happened in car 1 and relate to the injuries claimed to have been sustained in car 1. Likewise with car escape is the second part that we're talking about here. So that's why it's probably more important here than what jurors processed. The tracker says, but will the judge or his clerk actually read this? I don't know. But it's a good look at what we could see on an appeal argument. And hey, Fahim, welcome back. And Lauren, when that in quotes, that had me dying on the inside. I had to keep it together. But yeah, I like some of the way they write stuff. It's entertaining. And then, hey, Wavy, I feel like I haven't seen you in a bit. And then the intentionality was on Gracie's part. And then Tracker, I think Priya was watching us pick this shit case apart. And if I remember correctly, Nate the lawyer was like, these, and you know, he's worked in New York. He's like, these charges can't stick together, like they're not compatible. You can't have both. You can't argue both. It doesn't make sense. And then it's an incompatible verdict if they reject on the intentional assault charges, but then convict on these other 2. So Nate the lawyer, like when he looked at the charges and how the verdict came down, split the way it was, he was like, oh, that doesn't work. So shout out to Nate the lawyer. Nate the lawyer was on it. And then let's see. Must convict beyond reasonable doubt. If it exists, there can be no conviction. Well, here they're not exactly arguing that, because reasonable doubt is up to the discretion of the jury and the finder of facts. But what they're arguing, and it parallels what you're saying, is they must have had to speculate, because there literally is no evidence to this argument of recklessness. And since there is no evidence at all, they must have speculated. And if you're speculating, there necessarily must be reasonable doubt. But you can't really just come out and decide for the jury if there was doubt or not between them. You have to kind of make this roundabout legal argument. And then, heck yeah, I'm reading this and I'm like, let's go team, let's go Priya. Arbiko says, exactly, if he was ever to be charged, it should have always been the lesser charges. The bigger charges were always for the headlines. And they just kept shrinking. The jury didn't look at anything but skin color and the clock on the wall. And then, hey, Blue, good to see you. Sounds about right to me. No evidence was provided to even show he did anything. All they provided were pics of injuries. She never stated when the injuries occurred. She was like, I wasn't looking, but it happened at some point. And then, Erica, thank you so much for your super chat, and thank you so much for just being in the chat all the time anyway. I can't say enough how appreciative I am for your time and diligence, Kat. Many thank you. No, thank you, because you're like a detective. You're one of the detective names I recognize, pointing out all the details in these chats, and all that stuff's important. I want to make sure I get your second comment here, where his attorneys are doing a fantastic job. If the judge doesn't scrutinize himself, he will get corrected by the appeals court 100. I agree. Like, I honestly really thought the motion to dismiss was well written. And then the first response we got back from Judge Gaffey was like, no, your math is wrong. And I was like, I don't know. I thought Priya, Seth, and David did a really good job giving a conservative estimate of the days that had gone by, leading up to what should have been a 90-day speedy trial for Jonathan Majors. But who knows? Appreciate you, Erica. I'll take a sip of my water and we'll get into some background information. And again, we're going to get some details that we're already familiar with, but it'll be a good refresher. But keep your eyes peeled for little details that aren't available to us otherwise, because sometimes you get stuff like that in this. So, procedural posture. Mr. Majors was arrested and arraigned on March 25th, 2023. The original misdemeanor complaint filed on that day, the May 2023 superseding information, and the November 2023 prosecutor's information each charged Mr. Majors with a total of 11 counts, 7 counts of assault or attempted assault, and 4 counts of harassment. Pursuant to much discussion prior to the commencement of trial, the people dismissed most of the charges prior to trial, and 4 counts remained against Mr. Majors. 3 misdemeanors and 1 violation. So the ones that stuck on trial, we're pretty well aware of these. Assault in the 3rd degree with intentional, assault in the 3rd degree with reckless, aggravated harassment in the 2nd, and then harassment in the 2nd. Both assault charges and the aggravated harassment charges were premised on allegations that Mr. Majors injured Ms. Jabari inside the Cadillac Escalade, car 1, by breaking her right middle finger and lacerating the back of her right ear after she saw a text message from another woman on his phone and then grabbed his phone from him. The harassment charge was premised on the allegation that Mr. Majors made physical contact with Ms. Jabari with intent to harass, annoy, or alarm her during the car escape. When, seconds after they emerged from the Escalade, he placed her back into it. Relevant testimony. Oh my god, yay, we might get some quotes from the driver that we haven't seen before. That's fun. So, as noted above, the only testimony that in any way describes... We need Chillmonger in here, because Chillmonger can be like, who's the only witness that matters? As noted above, the only testimony that in any way described car 1 came from either Mr. Sarwar or from Ms. Jabari. Close review and analysis of both witnesses' testimony leaves no doubt. Mr. Sarwar undoubtedly said Mr. Majors is totally innocent, and Ms. Jabari undoubtedly said Mr. Majors acted intentionally. What follows, along with the transcript excerpts attached here too. Oh, I wish we had an appendix. That'd be so great. Maybe someday. Or we can order those transcripts, whatever. So, they attach the transcripts, respectively, represents every piece of testimony that either of them gave concerning what actions, if any, Mr. Majors took inside the vehicle during car 1. Now, guys, if you're just tuning in, I do want to underscore again that for the sake of this motion, this memorandum, car 1 is referring to what happened inside the Cadillac, and car escape is a new term that we're using to talk about what happened when the car stops and that door opens and they're getting out of the car on the door frame and Majors picks her up and puts her back in the SUV. So we have a new terminology. It's car 1 and then car escape. We're not talking about car 2 or car 3. So let's get into Naveed Sarwar. Mr. Sarwar's testimony, while acknowledging that he had his eyes on the road and not on the passengers, was nevertheless clear that to the best of his perception, Ms. Jabari was aggressively accosting Mr. Majors, who was only trying to get away from her. First, Mr. Sarwar testified that at several different points in the evening, prior to the ride back from Brooklyn to Manhattan, relations between Ms. Jabari and Mr. Majors were good. And that's going to be, all these footnotes are going to reference the transcripts. He also testified that neither of them appeared intoxicated as they left the Brooklyn Academy of Music for the restaurant. He then testified that at approximately 12:40 a.m. on March 25th, 2023, he was driving Mr. Majors and Ms. Jabari to Manhattan, and when we reached at Canal and Bowery Street, the girl, Ms. Jabari, said that, "I want to see something on your phone." He testified that the boy, Mr. Majors, said that there is nothing, but the girl was insisting. His testimony continued. Here we get a little bit of transcript, guys. And at this point in time, what, if any, movements did you hear in the back seat? The girl became very angry at that. Right. But what, if any, movements did you hear? I was looking straight. I was feeling that something is going on in the back seat. What happened next? When I reached at Canal and Center, so the boy wanted to get rid of the girl, and he opened the door. Okay, if you could just keep your opinions to what you saw and heard, Mr. Sarwar, in your answers, excuse me. The boy came out of the car. ... Mr. Sarwar, so we're skipping parts of testimony, I think, here, for the sake of the motion. Mr. Sarwar, what, if anything, did you see when the defendant opened the car? I saw that they were fighting among themselves. What, if anything, was the defendant doing at this time? He was trying to get rid of her. Again, if you could just keep your opinions and just stick to what you... Why is this? This is really the opinion that they're objecting to, or they're trying to rein him in on? Again, if you could just keep your opinions and just stick to what you... He was trying to get rid of her. And this is apparently where the court kind of chuckles a little bit. What did you see him do? He was saying, leave me alone. I want to go. I have to go. What did you see the defendant do? He was not doing anything. She was doing everything. And then they're just all transcript footnotes here until the last one. When he was questioned about what happened outside of the vehicle shortly after the alleged assault, Mr. Sawar testified that Mr. Majors, quote, was pushing Mr. Bari back into the car to get rid of her. Later, when questioned about events a few minutes after those described above, Mr. Sawar circled back to car 1 and testified that, as it was happening, he, quote, had a feeling the girl had hit the boy, based on, quote, the way she was fighting and the sounds produced. He also confirmed that he was looking ahead at the road during this time. Then we get to Grace Jabari. Mr. Bari gave a significant amount of testimony about what Mr. Majors did during car 1. And while her story changed wildly in some respects, one thing was consistent. She accused Mr. Majors of intentionally injuring her. Every piece of testimony that Mr. Bari gave, that's so good. I applaud them. Her story changed wildly in some respects. One thing was consistent. Just one. She accused Mr. Majors of injuring her intentionally. Every piece of testimony that Mr. Bari gave describing Mr. Majors' actions in the Escalade during car 1 is quoted or described below. And there's a footnote. The defense, to be clear, contends that none of this testimony is true, and it would not be unreasonable, based on the acquittal of Mr. Majors on the intentional assault charge, to infer that the jury did not believe it either. Fire in the footnotes! And all are included as part of Exhibit C here, too. Man, I wish we had... We need to get the driver's testimony. The following summary of the testimony makes two things clear. First, every word of Mr. Bari's testimony as to what happened during car 1 described unambiguously, no room for interpretation, intentional acts committed by Mr. Majors, and none established or even mildly suggested recklessness by Mr. Majors within the meaning of the penal law. This includes all testimony about pulling, twisting, struggling, grabbing being done in the car with intent to injure her. Second, the only testimony that Mr. Bari or any other witness gave that in any way spoke to Mr. Majors' intent when he placed her back into the SUV established that his sole intent was to escape her, and demonstrably not to harass, annoy, or alarm her. So now we're gonna see them pick apart the inconsistencies, at least on this angle. We get to watch someone else do it, guys. So, on direct examination, day 1, on December 5th, 2023, and remember, I'm not sure if there's transcript links in the description of this video, but if you go to one of the transcript reading videos, all of Grace Jabari's testimonies, there's a Google Drive folder. You can go and read them in detail if you want them in completeness. On December 5th, 2023, the first day of her direct testimony, Ms. Jabari testified that riding back to Chelsea from the restaurant in Brooklyn, Mr. Majors' demeanor was, quote, really nice and just quite loving, as they were, quote, leaning onto each other, with Ms. Jabari's head resting on Mr. Majors' shoulder. She also testified that he did not appear to be intoxicated earlier when they went from the play to the restaurant, and implied that he did not appear obviously intoxicated, at least when they set off for home. In the Escalade, Mr. Majors was scrolling on his phone. Ms. Jabari saw that he had sent a romantic song to another woman and then received a text message from the same woman. She testified that the text said, "Oh, I wish I was kissing you right now," or something like that. She asked Mr. Majors who he had sent the song to, and he protested that it's not what it looks like. Ms. Jabari characterized Mr. Majors' demeanor in this moment as, quote, alert. At that point, Ms. Jabari grabbed his phone and turned away from him, with her head facing down. She did not remember what hand he was holding the phone in, but she grabbed his phone, quote, really easily because he wasn't holding onto it tight, and, quote, turned away from him to her left with her hands clasped together because she wanted to look at the message. Then she testified, I felt like a heavy thud on top of me. I felt like what I knew to be the weight of him on top of me, and he was really trying to pry the phone out of my fingers, but I was just like going into like protective mode. I just kind of held over, and I felt like him kind of yank my arm. In this moment, Mr. Bari was facing away from Mr. Majors towards the left side of the vehicle, holding his phone in both hands clasped towards her chest. And Mr. Majors was trying to pry the phone out of her hands. Quote, just like really trying to let me let go of the object I was holding by, quote, peeling her right hand away as much as he could. Then Mr. Bari testified. Do we have a footnote on that one? Okay, wait, we have on 20. So we have a footnote here. Mr. Bari testified that she knew it was Mr. Majors' weight because he was the only other person other than the driver in the car. Fair enough. And then, so she's trying to pry the phone out of her hands, just like really trying to let me let go of the object I was holding by peeling her right hand away as much as he could. Then Mr. Bari testified, when that wasn't successful, he put my hand, my arm, and my hand behind my back. At this point, Mr. Bari attested she was holding the phone in her left hand while Mr. Majors held her right arm behind her back. She testified, I wasn't looking at him. I was kind of going into that zone, and I just felt like he was kind of twisting my arm and my hand and just trying to make me feel pain. That's the only way I could describe it. Yeah, it just felt excruciating and that kind of thing, so. And then they're noting that the emphasis, they bolded this text on purpose. She did not see Mr. Majors twisting her arm because she continued to face away from him as a self-protective measure. Mr. Bari testified that she felt pain for the first time when Mr. Majors came onto her, and then, quote, nothing felt comfortable after that. Do we have an actual footnote? All right, we don't really have. So the footnotes that we're going to see, I'm not going to look down anymore. But if the text is bolded, it's the defense adding the emphasis here in this writing. And we'll get to 32. We'll read that then. So when Mr. Majors was twisting her arm, it felt painful. It felt uncomfortable. I felt pressure on my hand like he was just trying to hurt me. So she's holding the phone on this one, and he's twisting the right hand that's on behind her back all the way on this side. But he's twisting that hand just because, even though it's not the one with the phone. Then, according to her testimony, Mr. Bari felt that's when she felt the pressure in her hand on her fingers. Then, according to her testimony, Mr. Bari felt a really hard blow across my head, on the right side, with an open hand in a fast motion. She was still looking away from Mr. Majors, but felt a hard impact to the back of my head, which caused, quote, a lot of pain. She then sat back due to the shock of that heavy impact in the head, which is when he then got the phone out of my hand. Okay. Mr. Bari felt really upset and confused and said, quote, if the text message is nothing, just show me it. At this time, Mr. Majors had his kind of arms out, like just pressing on my face and my body and, quote, everywhere he could reach. Mr. Bari also characterized this as, quote, pushing and as, quote, using his hands and arms like with force to push me, to, quote, try to keep me out of his way. She felt him pushing, quote, kind of everywhere. I don't know if we pointed that out. Try to keep me out of his way. I think we talked about that. But that doesn't really sound like, why would he be trying to get you out of the way if he was trying to get to you? I think we talked about that when we read it. There's just so much. She felt him pushing kind of everywhere. My arms, my face, my neck, my chest, head. I think when we read that, we were doing like the head, shoulders, knees, and toes thing. She tried to hit his arms away with her left hand. As she did, Mr. Majors sat on the chair. They made her repeat this part, and she dropped one of the body parts off. They're like, what parts again? Can you say that again? And she left one out. As she did, Mr. Majors, she tried to hit his arms with her left hand. As she did, Mr. Majors, quote, sat on the chair, just sitting there, and was touching her, quote, just anywhere he could get his hands on. So anything kind of that was visible to him on, quote, the right side, my head, my face, my neck, my body. Oh, and I missed this. She also testified that she couldn't move because of the pressure of his body and arms against mine. Do you see how, I'm having a hard time reading this and keeping up with it. And I know we felt that way when we were reading through the transcripts. And it's like, to know that we've read it before. And now I'm reading it again, and it's still like, what? It's not a good look. What are you guys thinking over here? Let's see. So for this motion, it's going to be Judge Gaffey that's going to see this, but Tracker's pointing out correctly, another judge will handle the appeal. And Juanita, yeah, let's say for people that are if you're not familiar with the Cadillac Escalade, or you didn't know that that was the car subject in this case, this trial, 17-inch gap between the seats. They're bucket seats. And yeah, this was a coach response Grace Jabari gave. To be honest, I don't know which part you're actually referring to. I'm assuming it's one of the, I just knew he was trying to make me feel pain or was trying to hurt me. But I think this characterization that it seems coached And maybe it wasn't even like the prosecution. I'm not saying the prosecution had to coach her, but it seemed intentional. It seemed like the, maybe disingenuous is kind of the phrase I'm looking for. She wanted the answer to come off a certain way, whether or not somebody else pushed her to give answers in that way. And then, pointing out, again, if you guys aren't aware, Tracker's reminding us all that her parents and sisters are lawyers. Her sister is a lawyer. And then, hey, Daisy, always good to see you. Everyone's showing love. And Gracie's just a pile of projection. And then let's see. And then reading her transcripts made my head hurt. I agree. She's so chaotic. Was she drunk on the stand? A lot of incoherent babble. You know, I don't know. And not to get too far off topic, but I swear she posted some content for us today on Instagram. Let me see. Speaking of alcohol on the stand, I don't think she was drinking on the stand. I don't think that at all. But I still think drinking might be a problem in her life. Because she posted this nice content for us. And this was 2 days ago, actually. Guess what I miss? And here's your Coachella picture. So she's letting us know she misses the things, all the things that she used to do. And then, oops, I'm in the motion to dismiss tab. So yeah, don't think she was drunk on the stand, but I think she was drinking a lot before she had to testify and drinking a lot after she had to testify. And for many years before that, and will continue to do so for many years from this point forward. And I'm not demonizing alcohol, but I am demonizing that somebody assaulted someone on March 25th, and they wanted to downplay the role that alcohol may have played in that, and then they went on to lie about the events of that night to accuse someone else falsely. That's my grievance, not with anyone drinking for a good time. And then, yeah. So wait, I just clicked the wrong one. Get your measuring tape out, 17-inch gap. Yep. And then, how would she be laying on his shoulder with bucket seats? Queen, I don't think we know. I don't think we know. And then Tracker, that's why she wants back in the state. Did I say Coachella? I meant Glastonbury. I guess it's like sort of similar, but I definitely meant to say Glastonbury when I was referring to her Instagram. To me, in my head, it's like conceptually similar. It's going to stay an issue for her because she's in denial about her drinking. That's how it goes. And I don't know what she's missing except the wallet to pay for it. And then let's see. What? All right, maybe we should pull that up too. So Daisy with the extra credit. So I think it was Tracker that asked Daisy if she came with the extra credit homework today. So Detective Daisy says, do you guys know that in Priya's motion letter to permanently seal the Rolling Stone BS, that the DA wanted to include states, the DA never offered Jonathan Majors a plea at all. They always wanted this to go to trial, guys. Holy crap. Maybe we can pull that up too. Oh, is that a long document? Is that a long one? That's insane. So all of this, like, we know we've had so many conversations about, I'm shocked it even went to trial. There was no other choice. All right, cool. So guys, we'll make it happen. That's pretty short, but that detail right there is like, that's nuts. And Juanita says, I knew it. The plan was always to jail this man. Tracker says, I knew Hermione would always have the extra credit. Speaking of that, you know how I always pronounce names wrong? When the Harry Potter movies came out, I think when I read the books before the movies existed, I always read her name as like Hermione. And then the movies come out and I'm like, Hermione? Okay, sticking with it. I got it. But yeah, never been good at pronouncing names. And then we do love our extra credit students. I'm going to pull that back up one more time. In this motion to permanently seal the Molyneux evidence, the DA wanted to include the evidence. The DA never offered a plea. And so Daisy's pulling up the quotes. Mr. Majors would suffer by virtue of this case. Were part of the people's calculations in deciding to bring it in the first place. And in their decision to never make any plea offer, let alone the type of resolution typically offered to a first-time misdemeanor offender. Quote that part. Holy moly. That's true, right? So it's like, please get offered all the time. If you've watched any of the YSL trial, there's like people that have multiple offenses still getting offered plea deals in exchange for testimony or whatever. Grace Jabari got a deal. They didn't even offer. So, I've been complaining that, great, yeah, prosecutorial discretion exists, but the NYPD is a different entity from the Manhattan DA. One's a policing body, one's a prosecuting body. For the prosecuting body to say, hey, even though 2 NYPD districts precincts found probable cause to arrest, and then to say we're going to choose not to prosecute someone without even investigating ourselves, that means you're not giving a basis, a reasonable basis of why you're choosing to prosecute one person in a cross complaint over the other. That's problematic. And now we see that she was promised a plea deal for cooperation, but no plea deal was ever on the table in the beginning for Jonathan Majors, for a first-time offender. Oh my God. Like, I know that's like, and Daisy, thanks so much for that quote, because even though this is a small quote, what we have right here, it really says a lot. And didn't the other guys under Braggs go straight to trial too? I know Foss was offered a plea and Kevin Porter Jr. was offered a plea. Kevin Porter Jr. took the plea. So you might be referencing other people in addition that they're not popping into my head right away, but I'm sure some people got offered pleas and took it to trial and some chose to take the deal. And then people were ragging on Jonathan Majors and Priya Chaudhry, but they had no choice but to go to trial. Jonathan Majors seems headstrong and maybe would have rejected the plea, but he didn't have a choice. Exactly. It doesn't matter what someone would have done if it's standard to offer a plea. This is why I'm saying they are not going to go anywhere for a normal sentence request. The prosecution's going to be like, give them the maximum. Because this has always been a principle. This has always been a sign waving type of case. And yeah, Juanita, this entire case has been obviously unfair. They wanted the press and fundraising for the next campaign cycle. And let me remind you guys, this Sanctuary for Families lobbies for politicians, the one that helped Jabari get her pro bono attorney. Did I miss it? Wait, so do you mean the Business Insider wait, let's see. The same article with this motion? Yeah, okay, so Lauren, yeah, that's right, Lauren. So Lauren Victoria Burke says the Adam Foss plea was essentially lie and say you did it and never reveal the evidence that you're innocent. And I found on the internet that the fact that there was these people claiming that they were victims as well, right? There was this idea that there were other victims as well. You go out there and you read the actual tweets and you see what they're saying, and they're not even claiming to have been victims of any type of SA by Adam Foss. Then you read the actual accuser, who didn't really, to be fair, she accused him in a Medium blog post, and then years later, the Manhattan DA is like, we're going to press charges. So she might have just gotten like snowballed into moving along with the momentum that she initially started, but she didn't knock on the NYPD's door and be like, please prosecute this person. She just wrote a blog post. So she has some accountability, but the DA had their own mission, right? But her lie, Reagan Seeley's lie, her blog post was still published when I did coverage of it. Her lie is apparent right in her own blog post. She says she didn't consent. That's the argument of the case. But then in her own blog post, she describes the sexual encounter being on top and riding this man. So the theory of the case is that she was physically incapacitated and laid there, couldn't move. That was the theory of the case at trial. But in her blog post, she talks about how she sent him a text message. So there's another paper trail saying, I'm thinking about writing that blank again. Well, if the theory of your case is that the one time you've ever had an encounter, it was, the R word because you couldn't consent because you physically could not even move. But then you texted this person and then wrote a blog about this text, about how you were doing some type of sexual activity that, I'm no physicist, but you can't do that if you're physically incapable of moving. The lie that they put up against Adam Foss, they wanted him to take this plea deal and never be able to say that he was innocent. The lie that proved he was innocent was apparent in the blog post they used to bring charges against him. that's what the Manhattan DA seems to have a pattern of doing. I have a video on that if you want to like see what I'm talking about with those text messages and then the crowdsourcing of the Me Too style accusations on Twitter. But there's a video where I lay all that out. And I think Lauren Victoria Burke's channel, let me pull it up and put the link in, because she did a good summary video. Hold on, I'm on your Twitter. Kind of like pulling together the 3 similarities of these cases. All right, so Lauren's channel is in the chat if you guys want to make sure you're subscribed over there. And then Kevin Porter's girlfriend said repeatedly in interviews that Porter didn't injure her. Yeah, and that's crazy. And like, shout out to her for going up there and doing that, right? I mean, she probably wants to make sure she's not in a spot to get sued for defamation either, or false accusations, filing a false report. But at the same time, she's still advocating for the right thing for someone that's not even in a relationship with her anymore. So I thought that was really respectful of her. And then, yeah, Majors, Foss, and Porter. The cops and the DA brought these cases. None of the women contacted police or dialed 911. Majors dialed 911 because Jabari locked him out. And then let's see. Did I miss a comment? All right, so I'm gonna have to look. Daisy, if you do you mean by the article? Do you mean in that Business Insider article? This letter? That way I can just quickly grab it and we can pull it up. Yeah, the rabbit hole does compel me, you're right. Let me get back to this reading here. So, okay, awesome. Thanks so much, Daisy. So, Mr. Jabari, did I read this paragraph? Now I'm lost. So, all right, so let's see. She continued to face away. I think we're at this paragraph here. The blow on the head. So then, according to her testimony, Miss Jabari felt a really hard blow across my head on the right side with an open hand and a fast motion. She was still looking away from Mr. Majors, but felt a, quote, hard impact to the back of my head, which caused, quote, a lot of pain. She then sat back due to the shock of that heavy impact in the head, which is when he then got the phone out of my hand. Miss Jabari felt, quote, really upset and confused and said, if the text message is nothing, just show me it. At this time, Mr. Majors had his kind of arms out, like just pressing on my face and body, and everywhere he could reach. Mr. Jabari also characterized this as pushing and as using his hands and arms, like with force, to push me to, quote, try to keep me out of his way. She felt him pushing kind of everywhere, my arms, my face, my neck, my chest, head. She tried to hit his arms away with her left hand. As she did, Mr. Majors sat in the chair and was touching her, just anywhere he could get his hands on. So anything kind of that was visible to him on the right side of my head, my face, my neck, my body. Mr. Jabari testified that this interaction, quote, felt long, but I think it was probably just quite quick. She did not remember Mr. Majors saying anything during this moment. Mr. Jabari testified that after, quote, not very much time had passed, Mr. Majors told the driver to stop the car and exited the car once it stopped. Mr. Jabari followed him out onto the street. At this point, she testified, Mr. Majors turned around and, pushed me back into the car, basically. She testified as follows. Can you break down when you got out of the car, the first thing that happened that you remember? Yeah, I just remember him turned around and trying to make me stay in the car, basically. Sorry. How did the defendant try to make you stay in the car? Can you explain that? Just trying to push me in there and, stay kind of just, my body always felt really light in his hands, so it just felt, yeah, just like that. He was just forcing me to stay there. Where were your arms when the defendant was shoving you back inside the car? He was holding me with them. Where were your arms at? I don't know, just by my body. Day 2. On December 6, 2023, the second day of her direct testimony, the people returned to the events of Car 1 to inquire further about details. In response to their questions, Ms. Jabari testified that she felt pain when Mr. Majors was kind of prying my hands off the phone, but then felt substantial pain when Mr. Majors was applying pressure. I couldn't see what he was doing, but it just felt really uncomfortable. She further testified that it felt like he was twisting her arm for close to 30 seconds, and when asked which parts of her arm were twisted, she testified, just the whole of it. I mean, because I wasn't looking, I feel I can't say the exact movements he was doing, but the sensation of it was like everything was twisted, and he was just trying to move me and trying to make me hurt. So I would, I guess, not be hiding from him. And then we do have some footnotes towards the end. I'm going to try to read right when we read the line that they apply to. Ms. Jabari testified that the whole thing lasted, the hand and the turning, about, between 30 seconds to a minute. Overall, she then testified, the whole interaction felt like a couple of minutes. As regards to what happened outside the car after the alleged incident, Ms. Jabari testified that Mr. Majors, lifting her up off the ground such that they were face to face, slammed me against the door frame. Then he threw me back into the car, causing her to fall over. So we have two footnotes here. One is just the transcript lines. They're lining all these up. You see how far apart these are? We're going from page 180 to 267 to 451 to 477 to show her inconsistencies. The video, of course, showed that they were not face-to-face, and that, in fact, Ms. Jabari was facing the car when Mr. Majors placed her back in it. Later in her direct testimony, Ms. Jabari characterized Car 1 by stating that Mr. Majors, quote, went crazy. She further testified that she told the officers who found her later that morning in response to Mr. Majors' 911 call that she, quote, had kind of grabbed Mr. Majors' phone and that the injuries were caused by him trying to get the phone off me. Later, she still testified that a photo of her neck, that's in People's Exhibit, I think that's what we see Swain taking the pictures of in the body cam. Later still, she testified that a photo of her neck, quote, shows bruising that she sustained, quote, when he was pushing me against and slamming me back in the car, things like that. Although, and this is a footnote, although there was ample evidence contravening this stray assertion, it was a stray assertion, by Ms. Jabari, it is immaterial in any case because the people did not allege an injury to Ms. Jabari's neck, and so this testimony could not form the basis of any conviction. Finally, when asked by the people whom she felt was responsible for Mr. Majors' arrest, Ms. Jabari testified, I don't know exactly what I said, but I think I was saying I told them it was my fault. I grabbed the phone. That's why you attacked me, that kind of thing. Then we get to cross-examination. Ms. Jabari was cross-examined by defense counsel on December 6th and 7th, and her cross-examination included various questions about Car 1. Here again, every piece of testimony she gave that concerned Mr. Majors' actions during Car 1 is set out below and in the transcripts attached here too. Just as on direct examination, Ms. Jabari's story changed wildly on cross-examination, but was consistent in claiming that Mr. Majors acted intentionally. First, Ms. Jabari confirmed that Car 1 as a whole took about 2 minutes, and testified that it may have been longer than that, but probably not shorter. She also testified that she was in excruciating pain during Car 1, but did not scream or make any noise despite that fact. Separately, Ms. Jabari confirmed her testimony that the injuries that gave rise to the assault charges, in other words, her broken finger and the lacerated ear, occurred during Car 1 and not at a later point. Ms. Jabari also confirmed that she and Mr. Majors were sitting in the bucket seats in the row of seats behind the driver when Mr. Majors, quote, attacked her. In addition, Ms. Jabari testified that she remained seated in her driver's side chair during the entire altercation, and indeed until she exited the car once Mr. Majors opened the door, but that she, quote, assumed Mr. Majors, quote, got out of the seat because she felt his weight on me. She further testified that neither she nor Mr. Majors fell down inside the car at any point, that she was not wearing a seatbelt by the time she exited the car, but likely had put one on earlier, and that she did not remember Mr. Majors saying anything about during the altercation until he asked Mr. Sarwar to stop the car. And then no footnotes there, still just transcripts. In other words, she claimed Mr. Majors' actions described his intent. Ms. Jabari's cross-examination testimony included a further description of what she specifically felt Mr. Majors doing during the altercation. After testifying, she felt him put his hands on her face and push at her whole body. Ms. Jabari made several gestures to demonstrate what she felt Mr. Majors doing, which were duly described for the record. Placing her open right hand on the side of her face and pushing her head to the left, pressing her left hand to her chest around the collarbone, touching the right side of her chest with her left hand between her collarbone and armpit, and making a gesture towards her throat with an open hand while also making a gesture on her chest around her sternum. I was confused when we were reading that part of testimony. Do you guys remember that? I couldn't figure out the mechanism of how she was trying to describe that. During these events, Ms. Jabari testified she remained seated on the edge of her bucket seat, and Mr. Majors was facing her and pushing against her while also remaining seated in his own bucket seat, 17 inches apart. Ms. Jabari testified that Mr. Majors', quote, arm was firmly out and he was just pushing me and I was trying to get him off of me. He was using both arms. She did not receive any scratches on her chest from any contact Mr. Majors made with it. Later, the questioning returned to the way in which Mr. Majors allegedly twisted Mr. Bari's arm before pushing against her. She testified that when he twisted her arm, he was touching her upper arm and also her hands, including her whole right hand, to which he applied a lot of pressure, and her fingers. She testified that he was applying a lot of force and causing pain to her upper right arm and also her right forearm. She testified that, in the motion of it being twisted, at points my hand was in a lot of pain, so I'd see he was using a hand, whether it was one or two, to manipulate my fingers. She was still holding his phone in her left hand at this time, and what he was doing to her arm, quote, felt quite sustained. It felt like he was trying to make me react. He was trying to make me feel pain. Mr. Bari also testified as to what information she gave police officers that arrived at the apartment in response to Mr. Major's 911 call. Specifically, she testified, 1, that she told them she did not remember how her finger got hurt, that she demonstrated to the police how Mr. Majors had grabbed her by placing one of her hands over the other hand. 3, that Mr. Majors had been pushing her head at one point. 4, that she could not work out why her ear hurt. 5, that she did not know what exact movement caused her injuries. And 6, that she did not know what happened to her finger. She also stated under oath that later at the hospital, she told police that Mr. Majors had intentionally caused the injuries to her car, her ear and finger. So they're pointing, I like the way Priya writes, or whoever actually wrote it. They're lining up. You didn't know what happened to your finger, but you testified under oath that at the hospital you told police that it was intentional and you suddenly knew how it happened. Thereafter, Mr. Bari testified as to what she said about her injuries in the days and weeks following March 25th, 2023. So they're getting into, we heard that Priya kept circling back to these same questions. And didn't you say, who did you tell? Did you tell anybody? That all that stuff is coming into play now. Thereafter, Ms. Jabari testified as to what she said about her injuries in the days and weeks following March 25th. Asked whether she had said 2 days earlier, after the alleged incident, that it was the, quote, scrappiness of her movements that caused the injuries, she testified that she could not remember. But she did confirm that on May 9th, 2023, she swore under penalty of perjury that she, quote, observed Mr. Majors strike her with a hand across her right ear, causing substantial pain and laceration behind her right ear. Even though she told the jury during the trial in December 2023 that she was looking away when Mr. Majors made the motion towards her head and therefore did not see what he did. That's why they ask her on redirect, oh, and do you understand what the word observe means? And she's like, no, I don't. Where did you go to law school? And then they sustain that question. They strike that question. Lastly, Mr. Bari confirmed that she said to Mr. Majors in a text message, I told them, meaning law enforcement, it was my fault for trying to grab your phone. On December 13th, 2023, the court emailed the parties a copy of its proposed charge and verdict sheet. Okay, so this is right before trial, like jury instructions here. I wonder if we'll get to see that. I mean, it's referring to an email, so we're just going to get these quotes, but we'll see what we can get out of this memorandum here. So December 13th, 2023, so this is before deliberations. The court emailed the parties a copy of its proposed charge and verdict sheet. The proposed charge contained both 1 count of assault in the 3rd degree intentional and 1 count of assault in the 3rd degree reckless. On the same date, the defense emailed the court objecting to the submission of both counts. So they're saying, like, we objected to it. You can't tell us that we should have raised this issue during the course of the trial. We did. Here's the date on which this happened. On the same date, the defense emailed the court objecting to the submission of both counts, requesting that the court only submit to the jury the 1st count of assault in the 3rd degree under an intentional theory, because the people have not proffered any evidence in support of a theory that Mr. Majors acted recklessly. The following day, the court heard arguments on this issue, among others. I wonder if this is where we get the intent on his face argument. The defense, in keeping with its email to the court the previous day, argued that the intentional assault count and the reckless assault count were inconsistent charges, and that the people had not put forth any evidence supporting a recklessness theory. The people disagreed. Okay, so this is Mr. Perez here. So this is the ADA arguing. I believe it is within the court's discretion to submit those 2 charges to the jury as alternate theories, reckless being the alternate theory to intentional. We do believe that there is a view of the evidence that would allow the jury to find the defendant guilty of the reckless charge and not the intentional. Just to give one example, Your Honor did hear testimony from Ms. Jabari in which she stated that at the time she received the blow to the back of her ear, that she was not looking, wasn't able to see what actually struck her. So I think that's one example of how the jury could perceive the defendant's action under a reckless theory as opposed to intentional assault theory, which is why we have Priya pointing out that she's perjuring. She signed a statement under penalty of perjury saying she observed it later, the same detail that they're referencing here, as opposed to intentional assault theory. And so, for those reasons, we're asking the court exercise its proper discretion and submit both charges to the jury. So, I think that's one example. He thinks that this counts as one example, and it's the only example he can give, and says, and so, for those reasons, I'm asking you, court, please use your discretion and submit both charges to the jury. Do we have any footnotes? We just have the conference transcripts. The court denied the defense's request on the following rationale. So this is what Judge Gaffey decided and why. I would guide both sides to People v. Moore, which is what we're seeing referenced earlier when this memorandum started. A 2009 case, and it dealt with intentional assault and reckless assault in not identical facts, but facts that are quite similar to the case that's before the court, and that will be before this jury. And I do agree that there are many cases where there are an intentional theory and a reckless theory, where both should not go to the jury, where the only evidence that is before or presented to the jury is under an intentional theory. Here, the clear standard is a reasonable view of the evidence. There is a reasonable view of the evidence here where the jury could find that Mr. Majors did not intend to cause physical injury to Mr. Bari in the back of the vehicle, but there is a reasonable view of the evidence based upon the testimony that during the struggle in the back of the vehicle, at times over a phone, and there was testimony what happened during that struggle, that the jury could find that the conduct was reckless. Therefore, I will submit both charges, intentional and reckless, to the jury because there was a lot of testimony about pulling, twisting, struggling, grabbing, and therefore the jury could reasonably find recklessness. The court therefore submitted counts of both assault in the third degree, intentional, and assault in the third degree, reckless, to the jury. On December 18, 2023, after a total of approximately 5 to 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty on the intentional assault and the aggravated harassment charges, both of which required an intent to injure, and guilty on the reckless assault charges and the harassment charge. Standard of review. So, what we looked at yesterday, if you were in the stream. So, 330.30, that's the motion to set aside. That's what this memorandum supports. That statute empowers a trial court to, upon motion of the defendant, set aside or modify any part of a guilty verdict on, quote, any ground appearing in the record which, if raised upon an appeal from a prospective judgment of conviction, would require a reversal or modification of the judgment as a matter of law by an appellate court. This may be done at any time between the rendition of the verdict and sentencing. So that's why it's being filed at this time. There's no actual footnote. It's just citing the statute there. Now, this is where we're going to see the defense's argument to grant this motion. The best example that the people could muster, hey, wait, I just called that out. Look at me. The best example that the people could muster of evidence in this record that would support a reckless assault conviction was Mr. Bari's testimony that, quote, at the time she received the blow to the back of her ear, that she was not looking, wasn't able to see what actually struck her. In other words, the people argued that because Mr. Bari does not actually know what happened, because she did not see it, the jury was free to guess what happened, free to speculate that what happened was reckless, and then free to convict based on that wild guess and speculation. This amounts to a candid and frankly somewhat puzzling confession of ignorance of the applicable law. Mr. Bari's admitted ignorance of what Mr. Majors was doing was not a blank canvas on which the people could ask the jury to paint with speculation. An absence of evidence of intentional assault that will allow a jury to fill in the blanks with conjecture is not evidence of reckless assault. It is not evidence of anything. The people have the burden of overcoming the defendant's presumed innocence by proving to the jury the requisite mens rea for the offense in question. If they try and fail to do that, then the jury must continue to presume innocence and cannot simply land on a lesser criminal intent as a prosecutorial door prize. Oh, okay. They're calling it a door prize. The defense respectfully submits that the reckless assault charge should never have come near this jury in light of the absolute dearth of evidence in the record that would support it. So, insufficiency of the evidence. And that the harassment charge on which Mr. Majors was convicted is equally unsupported by any evidence. Accordingly, this court should set aside both verdicts and enter judgment of acquittal on both charges. So this was basically a summary of what we're about to go over. They're going to break down this one cause right here. Mr. Majors' reckless assault convictions should be set aside because the jury was improperly charged. The record reveals that the defense requested that the reckless assault charge not be submitted to the jury on two legal doctrines, that of inconsistent charges and insufficiency of the evidence. while the court denied that request on the basis of a third, that of lesser included offenses. In the end, though, the defense respectfully submits that under any of these doctrines, the court should have submitted only the intentional assault charge to the jury and not the reckless assault charge. The results, in other words, should be the same anyway. First, although the reckless assault count was in fact a lesser included offense of the intentional assault count, the analysis does not end there. Under applicable law, submission of a lesser included offense to a jury requires there to be a reasonable view of the evidence that would support conviction of the lesser included offense, but not the greater. A reasonable view in this context requires not just a material amount of evidence, but also an identifiable, rational basis in the record for accepting that evidence while rejecting the evidence that would support the conviction on the greater offense. None of these criteria is met here because there is no evidence at all that would support conviction on the reckless assault charge, as distinct from the intentional assault charge. This is because all of the evidence that could be interpreted as showing that Mr. Majors committed any assault during Car 1, which, to be clear, Mr. Majors continues to fully contest, would, if credited, show only an intentional assault. There's zero evidence that supports the conclusion that Mr. Majors consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk, which is the burden of the people must meet for a conviction on that charge. Second, the intentional assault charge and the reckless assault charge are legally inconsistent counts. And while trial courts do have discretion to submit inconsistent counts to a jury in the alternative to each other, the Court of Appeals has made it clear this should be a vanishingly rare occurrence. Because hey, this is a rare case though, because, it's rare to see something like this go to trial. It's rare we don't even get offered a plea deal. Let's just add in another little rare cherry to top it all off. The appeals court made it clear that this should be a vanishingly rare occurrence, because in all but the rarest of cases, the prosecution's evidence will quite clearly support one count and not another, in which case the court should dismiss the unsupported count. Here again, the abject lack of evidence of recklessness, which caused any injuries, places this case squarely within the ambit of that rule and not the limited exception to it. So great, we get that there's exceptions, rare exceptions, but that situation, this is not an exceptional situation. The court should not have submitted reckless assault to the jury as a lesser included offense of intentional assault because no reasonable view of the evidence supports the conviction for reckless assault. The court ruled at the December 14th, 2023 charge conference that the reckless assault count would be properly charged to the jury in the alternative as a lesser included offense. We have a footnote. Although the court did not use this precise term at this portion of the charge conference, it is nevertheless clear that, quote, lesser included offense is the rubric under which the court denied the defense's request, both because the case relied upon by the court was itself decided under that rubric. So, that's good. So, this team, Chaudhry's team, is pointing out, hey, judge, the very precedent you're trying to use here, People v. Moore, that's what the judge referenced here for his reasoning. That is all about lesser included offenses. And what you're doing here matches that rubric. So even though you didn't say that it was a lesser included offense, we have to look at it with that lens because it matches, and the precedent you're trying to cite, the case law you're trying to cite, applies to what to do with a lesser included offense. So this is actually a good footnote. And because the court separately identified the reasonable view of the evidence test for lesser included offenses as the governing standard for this issue. So I wonder who it was on the team that was like, oh, we're going to dive into the judge hinging on this People v. Moore. I wonder who that was. What are you guys thinking over here? Let's see. Jonathan Majors is improperly charged too. Sounds like it's a running rampant in New York City. I mean, meaning nothing to allow a merger of the offenses. I mean, it seems like they're saying with the circumstances of this case, they can't just throw in these offenses this way and make it justifiable under some whatever this case must be about. I'm not familiar with any decisions relating to People v. Moore specifically, but they're making the argument that whatever decisions were made in People v. Moore don't actually apply in the way that the judge reasoned that they do. And then QD1, hey, by the way. So I think this is a great motion. I agree. I mean, I like the little quips that are thrown in and sprinkled. They're nice entertainment. But I think, in all seriousness, the parts that matter are also well written. Your Honor, I don't think that. Somehow discrediting the driver, but when Grace sounds unsure and speculates, very much by... Yeah, that whole... As soon as he says it sounded like she was hitting him or she was doing everything or whatever. Oh, don't talk about your opinion. Oh, are you guys frozen? Anyone else? Well, let's see if it's GA or everybody. And I know you guys are on a delay from what I'm asking. So I'm going to start reading, and I'm going to check to see if you guys still say it's frozen, and then we'll work it out. Okay, so we're here after this footnote. All right, so GA, if you're frozen, do a refresh real quick and see if it works again. Thanks, you guys, for answering. The court ruled at the December 14th, 2023 charge conference that the reckless assault count would be properly charged to the jury in the alternative as a lesser included offense. And then we saw this footnote here that says, hey, you're the one citing the case. We've got to use your lens, Judge. Respectfully, that ruling was incorrect. In making its determination, the court is required to view the evidence in the light most favorable to the defendant and failed to do so here. So they're citing other case law where this is the case. Further, the court disregarded the principle that a lesser included offense may not be submitted to the jury if, quote, on the whole record, there is not some identifiable rational basis on which the jury could reject a portion of the prosecution's case, which is indispensable to establishment of the higher crime, and yet accept so much of the proof as would establish the lesser crime. So then they give another case. Without such an identifiable basis, charging the lesser included offense would force the jury to resort to sheer speculation. Because the trial record does not contain any non-speculative evidence that Mr. Majors acted recklessly and caused injuries as a result of said recklessness, as opposed to intentionally, or not at all, there was no reasonable view of the evidence that would support conviction on the reckless assault charge. For that reason, this charge never should have been submitted to the jury. Applicable law, so they're going to go over everything that applies here. For lesser included offenses, the analysis starts with Criminal Penal Law 350 Section 1, which provides relevant part. In submitting a count of an indictment to the jury, the court in its discretion may, in addition to submitting the greatest offense, which it is required to submit in the alternative any lesser included offense if there is a reasonable view of the evidence which would support a finding that the defendant committed such lesser offense but did not commit the greater. If there's no reasonable view of the evidence that would support such a finding, the court may not submit lesser. Oh, that's pretty direct. This is right from the penal law. It says if there is no reason, it's like word for word what they're arguing. If there is no reasonable view of the evidence which would support such a finding of recklessness, the court may not submit such lesser offense. So at this point, guys, anyone, especially if you've been here to read through all the transcripts, again, we don't have the driver's testimony, but there was a lot of court reporting that day. Do you think from Grace Jabari's testimony, there was anything in either direct or cross-examination that is testimony evidence towards Jonathan Majors acting recklessly and causing an injury as a result of that recklessness? It doesn't even need, honestly, I don't even need to apply just to the finger or the ear injury. If you want to just say acting recklessly, period. What do you guys think? Priya laid all that out and then said applicable law, boom, it's exactly that. Lesser included offense is defined as follows. When it is impossible to commit a particular crime without concomitantly committing, by the same conduct, another offense of lesser grade or degree, the latter is, with respect to the former, a lesser included offense. So what this means here is like, it's the exact same instance, the exact same actual thing. So if you want to try to tack two things to it, that's what we conceptualize as a lesser included offense. And that's how criminal penal law in New York defines it. They're citing it here. And when the only thing that differs between two crimes is the culpable mental states, the crime with the lower culpable mental state is a lesser included offense of that with the higher. As noted, a court may not submit a lesser included offense to a jury if there is no reasonable view of the evidence which would support that the defendant committed such lesser offenses but did not commit the greater. This is a real and exacting requirement. In other words, no discretion, no subjectiveness. In case after case, the Court of Appeals and the First Department have repeatedly held that a lesser included offense must not be submitted to the jury if the record has no basis other than speculation for the jury to find that the defendant committed the lesser included offense, but not the greater. Oh, we've got a long footnote. So this just looks like they're citing a ton. We just heard her say they say the appeals court, case after case, has agreed with this. So I'm not going to read all of these different cases that they're citing, but we can see some of these quotes. Offense may not be charged where no identifiable record basis exists upon which the jury might reasonably differentiate between segments of a witness's testimony, because doing so would, quote, force the jury to resort to sheer speculation. Another quote, upholding denial of charge where, quote, there was no rational basis without resort to speculation upon which the jury could find that the defendant committed offense. And then do we have any more? One more quote. Lesser included offense charges inappropriate if they are, quote, based on speculation and are not supported by the record. So they give a bunch of citations here to support what they're talking about in this footnote here. And then let's see. We were up here somewhere, 82. Indeed, the standard is far greater than that, quote, not whether there is any view of the evidence that would the lesser offense. I think that means that would support the lesser offense. I think we're missing a word here. But whether there is a reasonable view of the evidence. Do we have a footnote for that? So these are just they're going to be citing case law and then another penal law. I think we had a word missing there for real though. And one common test for this is to ask whether there is some identifiable rational basis on which the jury could reject a portion of the evidence which is indispensable to establishment of the higher crime and yet accept so much of the proof as would establish the lesser crime. A reasonable view, in other words, does not require sufficient evidence, but also an articulable rational basis for crediting some pieces of evidence over others. So you can't just even if there was evidence to look at, you can't just it doesn't have to just be sufficient, but it has to be a rational basis for you to look at, credit this one, not that. Under penal law, a defendant is reckless when he or she is aware of and consciously disregards a substantial and unjustifiable risk that a given result will occur or that a given circumstance exists. Moreover, that risk must be of such nature and degree that disregard thereof constitutes a gross deviation from the standard of conduct that a reasonable person would observe in the situation. Thus, in the context of assault, the rule can be boiled down to this. The lesser included offense of reckless assault may be charged in the alternative to intentional assault only if there is a reasonable view of the evidence, as defined above, that the defendant was aware of and consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk of causing physical injury in a way that grossly deviated from what a reasonable person would do in the same situation. Now, that's where you guys all have this question. What is somebody supposed to do if not try to get away? Try to get out of the car and get away. Additionally, the reckless behavior must have caused the charged injuries. Applying this principle, appellate courts not might, but must have. Applying this principle, appellate courts have upheld numerous decisions by trial courts declining to charge reckless assault in the alternative to intentional assault because the evidence supported only intentional assault, or because of finding that the defendant committed reckless assault would require speculation by the fact finder. I'm sure this footnote is just for more. Yeah, so we've got other stuff here. We don't need to read all this, but this is a bunch of cases that, hey, over and over, the courts have adjudicated this, and it stands in our favor on the argument that we're making here. Let's see. No reasonable view of the trial evidence supported a reckless assault conviction because there was no evidence of recklessness. Applying these principles to the facts of the case, the reckless assault charge could not have been properly submitted to the jury alongside the intentional assault charge unless a reasonable view of the evidence adduced at trial would support a finding that Mr. Majors 1 was aware of, and 2, consciously disregarded, 3, a substantial and unjustifiable risk of causing physical injury to Ms. Jabari, and then another element that they have to meet 4, in gross deviation from the standard of conduct that a reasonable person would observe in that situation. And as also noted above, a reasonable view of the evidence requires that there be some identifiable rational basis on which a jury could reject evidence necessary to a conviction of intentional assault while accepting other evidence that would establish reckless assault. Now, these elements here that are bulleted out, it seems like that's probably jury instructions for this specific part of everything. That's probably why this is bulleted this way. And I don't think we got to look at the exact jury instructions. We just got to look at like template instructions that match the penal code for each charge. And then shout out, thank you so much, Lauren. I appreciate that. And I'm going to post your channel again. So the link in the chat right now, guys, is Lauren's channel. If you are not subscribed to Lauren Victoria Burke, make sure you do that because her videos are way better than mine anyway, but she has great insights. Now I blurred myself. Are we back? All right. Thank you so much again, Lauren. And then I'm catching this from Artemis. This actually highlights how reckless Jabroni was. Let's see. God, they've got so much. They're citing so much here. This is a misdemeanor appeal, and we're getting so many citations of case law that supports their argument. Here, the analysis does not even reach that second, more exacting step because there is simply no non-conjectural evidence of reckless assault by Mr. Majors against Ms. Jabari anywhere in the trial record, let alone enough to justify a reasonable view of the evidence and an unidentifiable basis for crediting some evidence while discarding other evidence. So, what happened when that chase video dropped on the internet that Wednesday? Where everyone finally saw this chase video and was like, what happened? How did the internet react to that? Minus the one or two outliers that found a way to twist it. No reasonable person. There were two testifying witnesses present in the Escalade during the alleged altercation. One, Mr. Sarwar, only gave exonerating testimony, suggesting that Mr. Majors did not commit any form of assault at all. The other, Mr. Jabari, only gave testimony that unambiguously described an intentional assault and no other kind. From start to finish, every point of her testimony reflects that characterization. She described Mr. Majors' demeanor throughout the relevant time as non-intoxicated, alert, and steady enough on his feet within the car to keep his balance, none of which is consistent with recklessness. She testified that Mr. Majors first made an unsuccessful attempt to take the phone out of her hand, and then testified as to a series of actions that on their face were intended to cause her injury, and which ultimately, according to her testimony, did cause the injuries underpinning this prosecution, twisting her arm and finger and just trying to make her feel pain, and then striking her across the head with a hard impact in a way that made her relinquish the phone. The injuries that, and again, his phone, the injuries that she complained of were alleged to be caused by the calculated, intentional, alleged actions mentioned above, twisting her head, striking her head, and she did not receive injuries more consistent with reckless behavior by Mr. Majors. For example, no scratches on her chest, faces, or arm. Oh, so that's actually... I mean, we've said it before, but it's no surprise that they had to be ready to prepare to file for post-conviction relief, right? But when I was initially reading the transcripts with you guys, when we were talking about the scratches on her chest, face, and arms, I just thought maybe it was point out like some general inconsistencies that she may have reported in, you know, when she was at Bellevue or something. Or to, if you don't have scratches here, how did you initially, they didn't really get to talk about the strangulation, but we could hear that in the public. You know, I thought they were just asking the questions to get more inconsistencies to come out. But if these questions were asked with the foresight that we'd have to be here in this moment fighting for post-conviction relief, these injuries are consistent with something that would be caused recklessly. You know, you could scratch someone in self-defense, or you could scratch someone by acting recklessly. And there's no evidence of this type of reckless injury anywhere on her. As if to remove any doubt, she expressly described Mr. Majors' actions as intentional. She testified that he was trying to hurt me, and that he was trying to make me hurt, so I would, I guess, not be hiding from him. Even when she was not directly characterizing Mr. Majors' alleged assault on her, she consistently described his actions in Car 1 in language evoking an intention to deliberately harm her, such as her assertions that he attacked her, and he was using a hand, whether one or two, to manipulate my fingers, and that he was trying to make me react. And then there's a footnote here. At the risk of stating the obvious, Mr. Majors vehemently contests all of the people in the back. This is a footnote for the people in the back. Mr. Majors vehemently contests all of Ms. Jabari's testimony to the effect that he caused her any physical injury and addresses it here only for the limited purpose of this motion. This is for all the people in the back, these footnotes. So, she testified that after he took his phone back, Mr. Majors went out of his way to push against her and various parts of her body at once. This testimony is not strictly relevant because it did not allege acts by Mr. Majors that were connected to, or even could physically have caused, any injuries Mr. Bari had, but it does further underscore that every act performed by Mr. Majors during car 1 was, according to Mr. Bari, unintentional. Or intentional. I'm reading it wrong. That every act, according to her, was intentional. She provided ample testimony that Mr. Majors was fiercely attempting to commit an entirely separate deliberate action than that is described above, getting away from Miss Jabari. Quite plainly, there is not a single piece of testimony provided by Mr. Bari or anyone else suggesting that Mr. Majors consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk of harming Mr. Bari in any way that is separable from the claim that he assaulted her with intent to cause her harm. Every statement she made about Mr. Majors' attempts to retrieve his phone from her described calm and calculated acts of intentional violence performed for the purpose of intimidating and or harming into returning his phone to him. Whew. In addition, see, this testimony is coming back to bite her in the butt. And if we were never able to look at her own thing, we would have had to wait for this motion to come out to even get a sample of the BS. That's why court should be transparent. At least a bit more transparent than not having any access at all besides 18 people sitting there that don't want to report on the case. In addition, the testimony Mr. Bari gave about Mr. Majors' actions during car 1 that were not clearly intended to force her to relinquish the phone. They give the example his pushing various parts of her body and face in the seconds after he got the phone back. Itself described purposeful acts rather than a conscious disregard of risk. But critically, even assuming that the jury could view that testimony as showing recklessness, which would of course require them to ignore that the testimony facially describes deliberate actions, Ms. Jabari connected absolutely none of those actions to her injuries. So that's why we saw those 1, 2, 3, those elements in that paragraph that I highlighted. Reasonably and under the penal law and what the jury is supposed to conclude, no reasonable person could say that these elements were met. Even these random things, they don't tie to any injuries that were alleged. And the jury is tasked with, hey, did this mechanism of injury, was it this? Did it meet the elements of third-degree assault? And here it's clearly missing this element as well. None of these alleged actions of touching Ms. Jabari's face, chest, or body could have caused her injuries, nor did she in fact have any injuries or marks from those allegations. Therefore, and call them allegations, therefore, because the people needed to prove that Mr. Majors caused injuries to Mr. Bari in order to convict him, and because the people were limited to the allegations of the injuries laid out in their charging instruments, a broken right middle finger, and laceration behind her right ear, the jury could not legally find that Mr. Majors committed reckless assault, even if they determined that Mr. Majors was reckless in the moment of car 1, but that Ms. Jabari was not injured during that reckless moment, as all of the evidence established. So it would be missing, even if they did this and that, it would still be missing another element. Because of the complete dearth of testimony as to reckless behavior, and because the people's theory of the case was premised exclusively on a calculated pattern of abuse and intentional behavior, the defense respectfully submits that the Moore decision cited by the court in denying Mr. Majors' request is I've never heard that word again. Inapposite here. I got a new word today, guys. The Second Department's opinion in Moore makes clear that, in this case, there was more than enough testimonial evidence to support both a narrative of intentional assault or a narrative of reckless assault. The facts in Moore are as follows, and they're pointing out how Moore, which the judge cited in his reasoning, is different and cannot be used in the circumstances of the Jonathan Majors case. 1, following a heated argument between the complainant, the defendant's girlfriend, and the defendant pushed her out of a vehicle, a truck. 2, after being pushed out of the vehicle, so in this situation, in Moore, there's an argument between a couple. The defendant pushes the girlfriend out of the car. So she's pushed out of the car. It's not the car stopping and someone asking to get out. 2, after being pushed out of the vehicle, the complainant opened the driver's door and was hanging onto the armrest in an attempt to get back in the vehicle. So the girlfriend opens back the door and is hanging on the armrest to try to get back into the vehicle. The defendant starts driving the truck for a significant distance with the complainant hanging on the outside. How is this comparable? Okay, So in this situation that the judge says is comparable, someone shoved out of a car. They're not trying to escape and getting out of the car themselves. And after that person gets out of the car, they get to the sidewalk and they end up trying to run away. In this case that they're trying to cite as comparable, the defendant is the one doing the pushing out of the car and driving a car while someone's clinging onto it. That's not the same thing. And Jonathan, they're saying it's the same thing, but Jonathan's trying to get someone back in the car, and in this case, they're trying. Oh my god, it's so funny to see them lay this out. Like, I feel like we just went through so much suspense, and then we got to this part here, and it's just like the bullet points of why it's so irrational. So, the defendant then drove the truck for a significant distance with the complainant hanging on the outside, swerving in apparent attempts to throw her off the vehicle. The vehicle that defendant was driving sideswiped a parked car, jumped a curb, and crashed into a tree and a fence. The complainant was thrown from the truck and suffered numerous injuries, including a fractured hip, and the defendant then fled the scene on foot. All right, I guess we kind of have... They're probably like, oh, well, Jonathan fled the scene on foot. That's the similarity, I guess. But only after... It's not the same fleeing. He tried to flee right away. Jonathan Majors tries to flee right away. Whoever this is and Moore, I guess Moore is the defendant, did all this other stuff and then tried to flee the scene after shoving someone out of the car and dragging them and causing them these injuries. Majors tried to flee the scene and allowed someone to stay in the car, but they didn't want to stay in the car. And he was trying to flee them. Like, this is not the same. This is like... There were no allegations in Moore that the charged incident was part of a larger pattern of abuse. Yeah, let's get that detail in there too. The alleged assaultive act in Moore was the defendant's decision to drive the complainant's truck at a high speed, so we're speeding, while the complainant was hanging, or maybe just a high speed, while the complainant was hanging on the armrest of the passenger side, attempting to get back into the vehicle. Based on those facts, on the complainant's testimony that she and the defendant were having a heated argument before he pushed her from the truck and sped off, and on other evidence, the Second Department held that a jury could reasonably conclude that the defendant's objective was not to seriously injure the complainant, but to shake her off the vehicle by operating the truck in a reckless manner, which ultimately injured her. There was simply no analog to that reasoning in this case. The testimony that, if credited, would establish that Mr. Majors caused Mr. Bari's injuries during Car 1, that is, the testimony of Mr. Bari herself, was categorically clear that Mr. Majors took the actions that caused those injuries for the purpose of harming Mr. Bari. There is, on the other hand, no testimony establishing or even suggesting a specific substantial and unjustifiable risk of harm that Mr. Majors knew and consciously disregarded. It certainly would not be a reasonable view of the evidence to premise a reckless assault charge on a theory that Mr. Majors was trying to get his phone back and did so recklessly, putting aside that the actions that allegedly caused Mr. Bari's injuries were the same ones that she characterized as intending to hurt her. There is no evidence in the record that when Mr. Majors was trying to pry her fingers off the phone, he consciously disregarded any particular risk in doing so. There must be some non-speculative affirmation evidence of recklessness in the record to justify a reasonable view of the evidence as pointing in that direction, and there is none. Now, are you at this point, will we say this, because this is like an ultimate kind of answer, right? It's all the way to the extreme. There's absolutely none. Do you think this is valid? Do you think that there's absolutely no evidence that is not speculative in nature in some way? Or do you think Priya, Seth, David Winkler, and Arshad, the four of them in writing this, are just using lawyerly talk to make something sound good? The defense submits that the Court of Appeals decision in People v. Galvin is more closely on point, as it too concerned a situation that involved alleged conduct for which the only evidence pointed to intentional actions and not reckless ones. In Galvin, the only witness, besides the defendant and the complainant, to have a clear view of the altercation testified. Now remember, the defense is saying this situation is more similar to this case. So you should take a look at that one. In Galvin, the only witness, besides the defendant and the complainant, to have a clear view of the altercation testified unambiguously that the defendant was atop the victim, holding the latter's head with both hands and striking it against the sidewalk. On these facts, the Court of Appeals held that there was no reasonable view of the evidence other than that the victim's injuries resulted from the pounding of his head against the pavement. and dismissed the possibility that the injuries were received in a mere scuffle or from an accidental fall as sheer speculation. So recklessness can't apply here. Similarly, any claim about the evidence supporting a finding of recklessness in this case is sheer speculation. The Court of Appeals in Galvin also found it significant that the testimony of the only third-party witness with a clear view was not contradicted by any of the other witnesses, all of whose testimony was simply less complete as a result of their inability from their vantage point to observe all that was happening. In the end, there was no disagreement with the witness who saw everything. And what did the driver see, guys? And the court also found it significant that the injuries were fully consistent with the witness's testimony. So the injuries are consistent with the witness's testimony. On each of these points, too, and they're referring to the appellate court. When they say this, the appeals court looks at it and says, well, it meets that element, that the injuries are consistent with what the evidence, the mechanism, when it was supposed to have occurred. On each of these points, too, Galvin mirrors this case. There's only one eyewitness who testified about what happened. No other witnesses contradicted Mr. Bari's account, or at least no other witnesses whose testimony could support a recklessness theory. And the eyewitness's testimony does not provide any medical basis for claiming that the injuries were caused by recklessness. Similarly, the First Department's decision in People v. Williams is akin to the issue presented here. In Williams, the evidence at trial established that following a verbal dispute, the defendant punched the victim in the face, breaking his glasses and causing injuries, including a facial fracture and laceration requiring stitches. Damn. The First Department held that the Supreme Court correctly declined to consider reckless. All right, so in this case, cool. Okay. So it looks like it was appealed after one appeals court made a decision. It had to be reaffirmed again because the appeal decision was appealed. That's how long these things can take, guys. So they're citing things that have been adjudicated at a higher level here. So the First Department held that the Supreme Court correctly declined to consider reckless third-degree assault as a lesser-included offense. That charge was not supported by a reasonable view of the evidence, viewed most favorably to the defendant. Says citation omitted. The evidence presented demonstrated that defendant's act could only be viewed as evincing, at least, an intent to cause physical injury, and there was no evidence to support a theory of recklessness. Citation omitted. And this is important because I think this is the second case now that the defense is like, hey, consider these cases, and they've been adjudicated at a higher level than just one appeals court. It's higher up in the rankings. Likewise, the first appealment in People v. Gutt found that the defendant's act of deliberately stabbing the victim could only be viewed as evincing at least an intent to cause physical injury, and there was no evidence to support a theory of recklessness. Thus, the First Department held that the trial court properly declined to submit reckless third-degree assault as a lesser-included offense, since there was no reasonable view of the evidence, viewed in the light most favorable to the defendant, that he acted with mere recklessness. For similar reasons as Galvin, Williams, and Gutt, amongst many others, the defense must respectfully take exception to the court's determination that, because there was a lot of testimony about pulling, twisting, struggling, grabbing, the jury could reasonably find recklessness. While this is an accurate characterization of some of the testimony, none of the testimony concerning any of those things that occurred in the back of the Escalade during Car 1 in any way supports the conclusion that Mr. Majors acted recklessly. In other words, that he consciously disregarded a substantial and unjustifiable risk in a manner that grossly deviated from what a reasonable person would do. All testimony that Jabari provided about pulling, twisting, struggling, and grabbing in the back of Car 1 that led to her injuries supported a narrative that Mr. Majors acted with intent to cause her injury, and only that narrative, not one of recklessness. The simple fact that there was testimony about actions that, depending on the circumstances, could have been done with intent to injure or could have been done recklessly does not justify presenting a reckless assault charge to the jury, unless there is at least some quantum of evidence that would independently support that charge. Here, there was not. All evidence pointed either to intentional assault or to no assault at all, which was, of course, consistent with the people's repeated insistence that the alleged assault on March 25, 2023 was part of a larger pattern of calculated control and manipulation of Mr. Jabari by Mr. Majors. Lastly, it is worth addressing that the people's argument at the charge conference that, at the time Ms. Jabari received the blow to the back of her ear, she was not looking, wasn't able to see what actually struck her, and that is one example of how the jury could perceive. Yeah, so that thing again. This is what Mr. Perez argued that we read at the beginning of this motion, that little paragraph from him. Yeah, one example, I think this is one example. We're missing that part. I think one example of how the jury could perceive the defendant's actions under a reckless theory as opposed to intentional assault theory. This reflects a grave misunderstanding of how much evidence is needed to justify the charging of a lesser included offense. The fact that Mr. Bari was not looking and therefore was not able to see anything about the way in Mr. Majors allegedly struck her most certainly does not constitute evidence that he was acting recklessly. Had her testimony been that Mr. Majors was not looking, that might be a sufficient basis of his recklessness. There might also be a valid basis for a finding of recklessness if Mr. Bari's testimony showed that Mr. Majors had, as in cases where sufficient evidence has actually supported reckless assault convictions, driven the Escalade at top speed through an obvious red light. So they're pointing out, they saved the suspenseful moments. Do you see this? How they're like dropping and then they're building it up. So now they're going back to these specific cases that they talked about briefly, and they're dropping in another detail that's so starkly different. So had Majors actually driven the Escalade, we know he wasn't even driving at all, at top speed, he wasn't driving at all. Through an obvious red light, he wasn't driving at all. So none of these three things could be something Jonathan Majors was similarly doing. He said, oh, it's a red light, let's actually stop and let's get out of the car. Then they go to the next case. Or tossed an object at Mr. Bari he had a reason to think was dangerous. He didn't throw anything. She threw something, though. And she said she didn't know what it was. That was car part 2. That was between car part 2 and 3 when she got her purse back. She threw something. Or menacingly waved a gun at Mr. Bari that he should have known was loaded. Yeah, and there was no gun in the story at all. So this is so funny because they really wait to this one sentence to point out the ludicrous type of comparison. But to say that Mr. Bari's looking away could be the basis for a jury to convict on a reckless theory is really to admit that the jury would have more room to speculate that Mr. Majors was reckless than they would have if Mr. Bari had been watching him, and that sort of speculation is precisely what the case law holds is impermissible. There's no discretion. The people's burden is to prove every element of every charged offense beyond a reasonable doubt. If those bedrock principles of criminal due process mean anything at all, they mean that the people must put forward some minimal amount of affirmative evidence pointing to reckless assault in order for the reasonable view of the evidence standard to be satisfied. They have not done so. Instead, they have put forth testimonial evidence that Mr. Majors committed no assault at all, and testimonial evidence, albeit scattershot, and frequently self-contradicting testimonial evidence that he committed intentional assault. Not a single piece of evidence points to recklessness. For that reason, the court should set aside the jury's verdict and enter a judgment of acquittal on that count. And we have a footnote here. I skipped some here. It's just citing into the case law that we were talking about. The only piece of Mr. Bari's testimony that could conceivably be argued to be susceptible to an interpretation in support of recklessness is her statement that Mr. Majors went crazy after she started scrapping with him for his phone. But even this statement could only have that meaning if taken out of context. Amid several days of testimony and otherwise paints a picture exclusively of intentional assault, the word crazy can only be understood to describe his intentional behavior. She also did not attribute, because they alleged a pattern of it, right? She also did not attribute the actions that caused her injury to this passing word of crazy. So the injury, it doesn't meet the element of this is what caused the injuries. There's quite simply no evidence for reckless assault. As a separate ground, the court should not have submitted both counts of assault to the jury because they're inconsistent. So all of this was insufficient evidence and, bad decision by the judge's part. We're going to talk about another reason they shouldn't have submitted these charges to the jury, but it's the inconsistency, the incompatibility with each other. Applicable law. Under the criminal procedure law, 2 counts in a criminal prosecution are inconsistent when guilt of the offense charged in one necessarily negates guilt of the offense charged in the other. So that would be kind of like, I guess that's kind of what self-defense gets at, but the rule as regards inconsistent counts is that a trial court must submit at least one to the jury and may in its discretion submit them both in the alternative if a verdict of guilty upon either would be supported by legally sufficient trial evidence. At the same time, however, if the court is satisfied that a conviction upon one of the 2 inconsistent counts, though supported by legally sufficient trial evidence, would be against the weight of the evidence while a conviction upon the other would not, it may in its discretion submit the latter count only. Although the statute cited above provides for the submission of inconsistent counts to the jury, the New York case law, so precedent here, interpreting that statute in the parallel context of intentional versus reckless homicide, leaves no doubt that this, and we're not even at the level of homicide, and we got to go through all this, leaves no doubt that this should be an exceedingly uncommon occurrence. In People v. Suarez, for example, the Court of Appeals explained that twin count indictments should be rare, twin count submissions to a jury even rarer. For by the time that proof has been presented, it should be obvious in most cases whether or not the evidence establishes an intentional act or no other. So basically here, if you're supposed to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, if you want to submit two inconsistent charges, it's probably really rare that you can still, at the very end of your trial, after presenting your argument, insist that the two inconsistent charges are possible, because you already should have sufficiently established your theory of the case and proven it beyond a reasonable doubt. So to have to submit something just necessarily implies, inherently, has an uncertainty. Does that make sense? So that's why it should be rare, because it's exceptional that there wouldn't be an inherent uncertainty in that type of action by a prosecutor. They should know by the end of a trial, in almost all cases, the thing that they want to prove their case on, and for you to decide and charge as a juror. Where twin counts are charged, the Suarez court concluded, the trial court should presume that the defendant's conduct falls within only one category of the offense, and, unless compelling evidence is presented to the contrary, dismiss the count that is least appropriate to the facts. And then we're getting into the intentional assault and reckless assault charges were inconsistent and should not have both been charged. The jury in this case was instructed on one count of intentional assault and one count of reckless assault. These are inconsistent counts. Here again, this is made clear by analogy to an ample body of case law in the parallel homicide context. In People v. Gallagher, the Court of Appeals held that the crimes of intentional murder and reckless manslaughter of a single victim were inconsistent. One who acts intentionally, that is, with the conscious objective of bringing about that result, cannot at the same time act recklessly, that is, with conscious disregard of a substantial and unjustifiable risk that such a result will occur. The act is either intended or not intended, it cannot simultaneously be both. Thus, where the shooting, the act, and the death, the result, are the same, a defendant cannot be convicted twice, once for acting intentionally and once for acting recklessly. And we're reading, the precedent here, right? Or they're referencing the penal law. But this thing that's pointed out here, the main point, this takeaway of this paragraph here, is something that you guys all point out as common sense, right? It's just intuitive. How can it be both? So that's what they're pointing out. I see a lot of mentions of Kirby. Shout out to Kirby. Is Kirby here? Kirby, if you're looking... Shahid, if you're looking for a Kirby video, go to Danny Does This and That's channel. Danielle Atherton. She has 2 different interviews with Kirby. They're both really good. But more recently, the second one dove into some real specific stuff. Oh my god, it was so juicy. Let me just pull up her link. Duh. And I just want to make sure that that's what you guys are referencing, right? The interviews that Kirby's done with Danny. It's in my For You tab right here when I get to her page. Kirby's showing right up. Go to her live videos. I think both of them are live interviews that she had. Maybe they were regular videos. Yep, they're regular videos. They're the 2 most recent. Dang, she's got 3 videos with him. I missed one. I'm sure the 3rd one's good. I support and endorse all 3 of them, even though I've only seen 2 of them. But yeah, that's Danny Does This and That. Danny Does Law, Danielle Atherton's channel. You guys subscribe to her as well. People are mentioning Kirby. She's got 3 interviews with him, and he's so insightful, really easy to understand. And then, yeah, Daisy says the jury's decision was absolutely based on speculation. I really like the way they're laying this out with the bullet points of the cases that they want to reference too. I don't think the judge is gonna look at this for more than 2 seconds, but I think an appeals court, an actual appellate judge, kind of has more interest in reading arguments like this than a trial court does. So the same argument could be made on appeal, guys. Although, did I skip something? Oh yeah, okay. So although Gallagher concerned homicide rather than assault, the penal law provisions defining intent and recklessness that it relied on applied generally, including to assault offenses. There is nothing about Gallagher's court's rationale that is unique to the homicide context, and other courts have applied the same rationale to the assault context. So they're going to give you a footnote here with other cases. And there's a summary here, holding that manslaughter requiring intent to cause serious physical injury, which requires intent, and depraved mind murder, which requires only recklessness, are inconsistent counts if submitted as to the same victim. So, and by the way, that's why the Courtney Clenny case, they only have that one charge. They're not trying to do both. They can't. So for similar reasons as discussed above in the context of lesser included offenses, the defense respectfully submits that this court erred in submitting both the intentional assault and the reckless assault counts to the jury. What cases like Gallagher and Robinson teach is that, as a practical matter, in all but the occasional outlier case, the people's proof will naturally point to an intentional offense or to a reckless offense, but seldom both, because in most cases, the difference between an intentional crime and a reckless crime is one of kind rather than degree. Courts might have difficulty implementing this principle in close cases. However, this is not a close case. In fact, if anything, the instant case is a perfect illustration of the Gallagher principle at work. Although the people started out charging both intentional and reckless assault, when it came down to the actual presentation of evidence, all of the evidence presented on which a jury could reasonably convict Mr. Majors was evidence of an intentional crime, not a reckless one. The jury rejected that evidence, and that should have ended this prosecution of Mr. Majors for assault. Accordingly, the defense respectfully submits that this case is not one of the rare instances in which inconsistent counts are properly presented to a jury, and that this court should have granted Mr. Majors' request not to submit the reckless assault charge to the jury for lack of any actual evidence of recklessness adduced at trial. And then 3, the court, we're almost there, guys. The court compounded its error. So they're stacking errors. The court compounded its error by submitting the reckless assault count to the jury without also submitting a justification charge. The defense maintains unequivocally that the court erred in submitting the reckless assault charge to the jury at all. However, having submitted the reckless assault charge over the objection of the defense, the court should have also sua sponte, I don't know what that means, submitted a, probably they necessarily submitted a justification charge along with it. The court compounded its error by failing to do so. There is no dispute that everything that happened on the night of March 25th, 2023 began with Grace Jabari illegally taking the property of Jonathan Majors. Yeah, drop the details, namely his iPhone. Ms. Jabari confessed as much. There is also no dispute that Ms. Jabari had no right to do this, and that Mr. Majors had every right, under the law, to defend his property and himself from this unlawful taking. Further, the driver's testimony was clear that Ms. Jabari was trying to take Mr. Majors' phone and the one doing everything, and that based on the sounds and movements Mr. Sarwar heard behind him, Mr. Jabari was hitting Mr. Majors. Thus, any and all physical interactions in the car stemmed from Mr. Jabari's attempted larceny against, and based on Mr. Sarwar's testimony and Mr. Majors' statements to the police the next morning, attempted assault of Mr. Majors. So, attempted larceny and attempted assault, Mr. Majors. Without question, so when they went to file that police report in the precinct, with the criminal mischief, that's probably relating to the phone in the car. Without question, the law allows everyone to use a reasonable amount of force in defense of their property. Indeed, justification charges exist for precisely this reason. The penal law provides that a person may use physical force, other than deadly physical force, upon another person, when and to the extent that he or she reasonably believes such to be necessary to prevent or terminate what he or she reasonably believes to be the commission or attempted commission by such of other person of larceny or of criminal mischief with respect to property other than premises. This is what you've all been waiting for. This is what you've all been waiting for. There it is right there. 3525, you guys. The Court of Appeals, someone tag Blabette and Flavio. Go tell them that it's here. The Court of Appeals has made it clear that the trial court must consider the record most favorably to the defendant. And when doing so, if the evidence supports the defense of justification, the trial court should instruct the jury as to the defense, and must when so requested. So did we request? From this, the Court of Appeals went on to conclude, it follows that if on any reasonable view of the evidence, the fact finder... Did they request it? If on any reasonable view of the evidence, the fact finder might have decided that defendant's actions were justified, the failure to charge the defense constitutes reversible error. And although the Court of Appeals in Paget highlighted that the instruction is mandatory when so requested, and should be provided even if not requested, maybe we didn't get a request then. What do you think? Both prior and subsequent appellate decisions leave no doubt that even when a defendant failed to request a justification charge, a reversal and a new trial is necessary. If, in fact, the evidence warranted such a charge and the trial court failed to provide it sua sponte. Here, the evidence more than warranted a charge. Are they going to say that they requested it? To the extent that the court gave the jury the duty to deliberate on whether Mr. Majors acted recklessly inside the car, and by doing so caused Ms. Jabari's injuries, the jury could not have made this determination fairly without being instructed on justification. In the specific context of the undisputed facts of this case, Ms. Jabari's confessed attempted larceny of Mr. Majors' property, the very language of the definition of reckless, unjustifiable risk, required the court, unambiguously, to instruct the jury on justification. By giving the jury the reckless assault count without including the justification charge, the court left the jury with an incomplete and inaccurate view of the law, and with the misapprehension that Mr. Majors had no right to have any physical contact with Ms. Jabari, reckless or otherwise, despite the undisputed fact that the physical contact occurred during and as a result of Ms. Jabari's admitted snatching of his property. For this reason, by failing to instruct the jury on justification, the court improperly transformed the reckless assault charge, which the defense still contends the jury never should have considered to begin with, into a strict liability event, improperly rendering the context of the alleged allegation immaterial. This constitutes reversible error under the governing precedents, including those set out above. Oh, so they didn't request it. But they're arguing that they don't need to request it. So, in addition to... I'm just happy to see this part, though, that we're getting 35-25 out here. But we're finally getting self-defense, you guys. In addition to the reasons described supra, this court should set aside the reckless assault conviction because the court also failed to instruct the jury on justification. Mr. Majors' harassment conviction, and that's why, remember, some of that charging language, I believe is one of the harassment charges, they didn't include the following language, which we all thought was interesting because it's like if you're being told to consider that something is harassment, and you have right in front of you that following someone is harassment, you might think while you're sitting there, well, it was the other person. It was Jabari that we saw was following that other person. So how could we convict the other person of the following? They left that language out of the jury instructions for that charge, which means you're letting them speculate on this other stuff that there's no evidence for. But you're removing their ability to come up with kind of this on their own. They can't speculate in that direction. So we all thought that that was interesting when we heard it reported because we haven't seen the literal jury instructions. We just know that typically that language about following is included and it was removed for this sake. In addition, we did that already. Mr. Majors' harassment conviction should be set aside for insufficient evidence. Applicable law. And this is like, I think, you guys might have seen my other videos, I think insufficient evidence has always been the thing. There just wasn't evidence tying that there's elements there, right? But especially that there's evidence that certain injuries happened at a given time, for sure. It's just not there. Applicable law. When the sufficiency of evidence supporting a guilty verdict is challenged on a post-trial motion, the trial court must determine whether there is a valid line of reasoning and permissible inferences from which a rational jury could have found the elements of the crime proved beyond a reasonable doubt. A legal sufficiency review requires evaluation of the evidence in the light most favorable to the people. A court making a legal sufficiency determination must marshal competent facts most favorable to the people and determine whether, as a matter of law, a jury could logically conclude that the people sustained its burden of proof. Essentially, the court sits as a 13th juror and decides which facts were proven at trial. The inquiry requires the court to consider the elements of the crime, for even if the prosecution's witnesses were credible, their testimony must prove the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. This is no less true when it comes to mens rea than it is for any other element, and unless the offense in question is a strict liability crime, evidence of the defendant's participation in the criminal act alone does not establish the requisite state of mind that must be proven for a conviction. The people did not put forward any evidence, let alone sufficient evidence, of the mens rea required for a second-degree harassment conviction. Any conviction of second-degree harassment requires the people to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant struck, shoved, kicked, or otherwise made physical contact with the complainant with intent to harass, annoy, or alarm him or her. Thus, in reviewing the sufficiency of the evidence underlying this conviction, this court must determine whether there was a valid line of reasoning and permissible inferences from which a rational jury could find that Mr. Majors made physical contact with Ms. Jabari during the car escape, specifically by lifting her up outside the Escalade and putting her down back inside of it, with the specific intention of harassing, annoying, or alarming her. The people presented no evidence at the trial that Mr. Majors took action with intent to harass, annoy, or alarm Ms. Jabari. In fact, every piece of evidence that can be arguably said to go towards Mr. Majors' intent, including the testimony of both the people's own witnesses, demonstrates that Mr. Majors acted with an entirely different intent to get away from Ms. Jabari as quickly as possible. As with the events inside the SUV, only Mr. Sarwar and Ms. Jabari provided testimony as to what happened outside, and both of them testified to Mr. Majors' obvious desire to put space between himself and Ms. Jabari. Mr. Sarwar's testimony was categorical in this regard. He stated that Mr. Majors was pushing Ms. Jabari back into the car to get rid of her. Ms. Jabari, for her part, stated over and over again that this was Mr. Majors' manifestly apparent aim, testifying that she, quote, remembered him turned around and trying to make me stay in the car, that he was just trying to push me in there, and that he was just forcing me to stay in there. Because the evidence demonstrated exclusively that the purported harassment was in reality an act of self-preservation, Mr. Majors committed in order to disengage from physical conflict that Ms. Jabari herself had initiated and continued to propagate. There was no rational basis for conviction on this count. And they're citing another case here, Geraldine v. Hale, that affirmed family court's dismissal of second-degree harassment, where credible evidence established that it was the complainant who initiated physical contact resulting in her injuries, whereas purported aggressor's conduct was an isolated incident rooted in self-defense rather than a course of conduct intended to harass, annoy, or alarm. To be clear, nothing prevented the people from asking Ms. Jabari further questions during trial, which may have led to actual evidence of Mr. Majors' mens rea sufficient to convict him of the harassment count, such as, what, if anything, did Mr. Majors say when he was placing you back in the car? Or, what was the expression on Mr. Majors' face when he was placing you back in the car? Or, what were you saying to Mr. Majors while he was placing you in the car? But the people never solicited any evidence. Remember, that mention of the intent on his face was during an argument to the judge. It wasn't testimony. That was the ADA making a response to the motion to dismiss the case, dismiss the charges, during the trial. That wasn't testimony evidence to the jury. So if you've heard me mention that, that was not like Grace Jabari's testimony. It was just an argument that ADA Perez made, that there was intent on his face. Or even, what were you saying to Mr. Majors while he was placing you in the car? But the people never solicited any evidence other than testimony from both Mr. Sarwar and Ms. Jabari that Mr. Majors' words, leave me alone, and demeanor proved that his intent was to get rid of Ms. Jabari. And good, they're correcting that language translation gap. Ms. Jabari, said Mr. Sarwar, and or to get her to stay in the car, said Ms. Jabari. No one said anything else. While it is true that the people relied on surveillance video to ask the jury to convict on the harassment count, what is depicted in it does not by itself provide enough for a rational trier of fact to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Majors acted with the requisite intent. People's Exhibit 5 depicts the physical component of the actions. It shows Mr. Majors putting his arms around Ms. Jabari, lifting her into the back of the SUV, and then interacting with her in some fashion with his arms obscured because they are inside the vehicle. As noted above, however, the act alone is not enough, since a defendant's physical contact does not, by itself, establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant intended to harass, annoy, or alarm the alleged victim during the alleged incident. Nor did Ms. Jabari, who was mere inches from Mr. Majors and could see, feel, and hear him, provide even a scintilla of evidence that his intent in that encounter met the mens rea required. In fact, her testimony did just the opposite. A conviction must be supported by sufficient evidence in the record from which to infer such an intent from his conduct and the surrounding circumstances. But all of the evidence at trial, including the video of Mr. Majors running away from Ms. Jabari immediately after the car escape, points toward his intent to flee, and there is no evidence of intent to harass, annoy, or alarm. For the foregoing reasons, Mr. Majors requests that this court, pursuant to penal law, procedure law, 33030, so that's the motion to set aside the verdict, set aside the jury's guilty verdict on the count of reckless third-degree assault, and the jury's guilty verdict on the count of second-degree harassment, and enter judgments of acquittal on both counts. So this was signed on Monday, and there's your team. And we're done. We did it. Let's see what you guys are saying over here. And just as a heads up, I think what I'm going to do is probably to keep the sheet. You just came in at the end. We did the whole reading of the motion to set aside the verdict. Lots of good nuggets, though. We do see that mention of self-defense. I really like the way that they laid out the relevant case law that applies, and then lined up the details and how they're so starkly different from the details of this case. I'm going to go through some comments, but before I do that, let me set some expectations. I do want to get to Daisy sent an email to me because she is Detective Daisy, and we're going to find out that Jonathan Majors was never offered a plea. And this is in the motion, the letter to keep the evidence that's currently sealed still under a protective order to keep it sealed. So that's 15 pages. I do want to read that, but I think if someone wants to come and look at the motion to set aside the verdict, I want them to be able to just find this video. And if someone wants to look at that, I want them to be able to find that video. So I'm going to read some comments, take a 30-minute break, schedule another live, and we'll read through those 15 pages, and they can be standalone videos on one distinct topic. Hope that works for you guys. And I want some caffeine. I'm like dying over here. I'm not sure if Kirby has a YouTube channel, and that's bad on me because I should be following Kirby. I'm not sure. And then let's see. Oh, you guys are so showing so much love for Kirby. And let's see, that was a defense error in not requesting it in the first place. So they don't need to. I have to look at their underlying, what they're citing there, but if they don't need to, they don't need to cite it. Because they use the language must in that area. So it seems like they're saying there's relevant case law or something that supports that they must, the court must have supplied that part of the instruction, and they didn't. So must means no discretion, no option not to include it, even if it's not requested. So we'll have to see how that plays out. That sounds like an appellate issue more than something that this judge will agree. Yeah, I was supposed to do that. And then Zach says, Priya's hitting on everything, which is great. Did she mention the DA inconsistently dropping her charges? She did mention the different charges, but it wasn't really like an in-depth dive on those specific charges or anything like that. It was just to get to the point of the 4 things that were actually at the start of the trial, bookending the trial, those 4 charges. So no, we didn't get her waving shots over like, you started with the strangulation charge and then you mean to tell me that we're just stuck with this unintentional argument? It's not really applicable because this motion has to relate to the verdict. And those guilty charges are really just 2 charges. The only reason the other 2 charges are relevant is because it makes the 2 convictions, they're incompatible with what the jury agreed was not proven. So it just wouldn't have been relevant in this type of motion to talk about those things. But it's something we could see as part of the appeal argument. And then the larceny. Yeah, everyone's here finally. The self-defense. Daisy says, yeah, the DA knew they had a weak case and stacked those similar charges, which obviously confused the jurors in addition to their biases, and here we are. And it's the cookie thing. You don't want to take the last cookie, but if there's 4 cookies, you might take one. We get together for the official Jonathan Majors town hall meeting every time there's a new detail that drops. And then let's see. What else you guys got? You can't commit a crime. So this is J-Rock. You can't commit a crime and then cry foul if you sustain an injury during the commission of said crime. Duh. Like, we have this common sense out here. I don't know. These jurors, I don't know. This is relevant, especially since he was found innocent of intentional assault. Yep. And yeah, let's emphasize that. So Erica, yeah, she took other property. So we have this other, when she's out of the hospital, she goes back to the penthouse and, some Rolexes are missing, some personal items are missing. Jonathan Majors also took that to a precinct. But the actual criminal mischief charge, the charge that the I-card was issued for that Grace Jabari had to turn herself in for, it was third-degree domestic assault and criminal mischief. They alleged when they went to this police department, that specific precinct, hey, in this car, this happened. This fight happened over the phone. She tried to steal his property. So it seems to me all along that if they went and did this, all along it's been in their head, this, what's the penal code? 3525, right? Let me not get that wrong. But 3525, this justification. If someone's doing something to you, someone takes your property, someone's stealing your property, now you have a justification to do what a reasonable person would do in response. To me, now understanding more clearly that this criminal mischief, they went and told this police precinct, this all happened, and it started because she took the phone. And the detective agreed. The I-card says this criminal mischief thing happened. This instance of theft happened. Or attempted theft, because it wasn't successful. So criminal mischief. So, I don't know. I'm starting to think that they might not have gone with the argument of self-defense during trial, but they seem to be privy to case law that the jury should have been told to consider such a reasonable response being self-defense. It wasn't there. Now it has to become an appeal issue, or at least in this case, post-conviction issue, right? But after sentencing, it could become an appeal issue. But I don't know, it seems like they went into that precinct with the whole strategy laid out. And a lot of my thoughts now are kind of bubbling, right? Because Daisy just let us know that we don't have a plea agreement. There was never a plea agreement offered to Jonathan Majors. So everything that's been part of strategy this whole course has been without a plea agreement ever offered or ever on the table. But I'm thinking from the moment that they walked up into that precinct to get that report filed, they knew that self-defense was a justification for, even if any injuries were caused by Jonathan Majors recklessly, that it would have been after the fight was started by Jonathan Majors because she wanted to take something that wasn't hers. But it's still important to recognize she also took other property later that night, or next day, that didn't belong to her. She just did it again. And then Tracker, he ran from her, and look how he was roasted for it. He was a little bit roasted for it, but at the same time, most people, I think more people roasted him for the closet, like with the body cam footage, when they got to see the closet, and they're all just like, oh, look at the boot collection. Like, the whole internet's like, whatever, there's like a girl laying on the ground here, going through it, but there's boots. Those are definitely Jonathan Majors' boots. But the chase video, even if there's like some comedic relief, I think the vast majority of people were like, damn, wait, what? Like, we even saw AV to the 7th power in real time, the first stream she did. Like, yeah, he was like chasing after her. Wait a minute. She was chasing him? Hold on. And then saw the video, and it's just like, that light bulb is like, how are we here? How did we get to this trial? And then Artemis, yeah, they thought they were within the grounds to allow speculation for the jury, which Priya Chaudhry just shut down. I love that she's calling this out so clearly. I mean, I thought the motion to dismiss was really well written too. And again, I can't see the body language of the court, but I get that there were some areas we wanted to see her ask some more questions about specific things. Knowing about the plot of the play, it's like, damn, I wish we got some push during that part of testimony. But maybe Priya Chaudhry didn't know what the play was about. Maybe she didn't probe and ask Jonathan, well, you went to see a play, what was the plot of it? Maybe it just never was something that came across Priya Chaudhry's awareness. But if it did, it would have been nice to see extra questions and kind of see Grace Jabari squirm, or have the jury know, hey, this is what she was just looking at for 2 or 3 hours, however long the play lasted. And then we'll show you, like, just pin that and we'll get back to it. But yeah, I think these arguments, both the motion to dismiss, what we're looking at right now, even the letter that she wrote to the court, I think it's always just a very structured story. It's easy to digest. It's well written. There's always like some type of case law that backs it up. And I know she gets her criticism, and that's fair enough, but I think this is strong. Whether this works or not, I'm thrilled to see her laying all this out there. We've been screaming this stuff for months, right? I'm losing my voice right now, you guys. So I said that last one, class, with everything that she stole from him, he should have filed felony charges against her. But then that would have been seen as petty and victimizing his victim again. Hey, they're always going to say that that's what he's doing. They're going to say this motion is litigation abuse. Like, I think they didn't request it because Grace Jabbari never got the phone, but based on how the incident is described by Grace Jabbari that he tried to receive it, he would have had every right to do that under self-defense. Yeah, oh yeah, that's true, guys, because remember, Jonathan Majors is like, she never actually obtained the phone. I had it in my hand the whole time. So, and again, that's a great point, Daisy, because throughout different mentions throughout this, there is emphasis periodically throughout this that it's according to Grace's testimony. If she gets the phone, this happens after she gets the phone. They do distinguish that according to her, she gets the phone. This is a very good point. And then let's see. Okay, so Artemis is reiterating that they don't need to request the justification argument in instructions to the jury. It's just the obligation of the prosecution to provide it regardless, or of the court to provide it. They showed and listed appellate precedent. Yep. In the Jonathan Majors interview, he said she never got it, but he did show her. That's when she freaked out and he fled. Yeah, so we're going back to that GMA interview. We don't have testimony from Jonathan Majors. The jury has no idea. But in the back of the defense's mind, you know, if they were told by Jonathan, their own client, that she never even got the phone out of my hand, she was trying to fight me for it, but it never actually left my hand. You know, it's not something that's, there's no testimony evidence to that. The only evidence that's actually on the record is from Grace Jabbari, whether it's true or not. So, great reiteration. And yeah, the harassment was the wrong way around. And that's like, we're all sitting here screaming that part too, right? Let's see. Dang, I try to catch up to you guys. You guys always have good conversations though. So let's see. Yeah, she has a different phone. He said yes, that was confusing when I started reading this too. So Cutie's pointing out she has a different phone. He said she tried to take the phone he had that night. So remember, Grace Jabbari has a phone apparently to this day that was a second phone that she used that Jonathan Majors, it's his, but he let her use. And she still has possession of that phone, and they were never able to look at it and examine it for, you know, records, text messages, just do any type of extraction on it. When I started reading this motion, I was like, oh, they're going to talk about that phone. And then no, it was obviously the phone in the car. I was a little confused for a split second there too. And another good point. So QT wants that she defrauded the victim's fund, and that's pretty serious. You're getting assistance from, and you know, obviously they would probably go on and continue to say, even if this conviction is reversed or whatever. I think this judgment alone shows that she was not a victim of abuse, right? This split verdict, she was not a victim of abuse, certainly not a pattern of abuse, right? So to me, for the nonprofit to still be kind of making these social media posts, they haven't made a lot, but right after the verdict, they celebrated it. They put it forward, they centerpieced it, because it looks like symbolically a win for victims. But if you're using something as a symbolic win for victims, the implication there is that Grace Jabbari was a victim. And I think the verdict we have right now currently does not suggest that. But even worse, if this were to continue to move forward and the conviction is reversed, it's retried, he's found not guilty on these two charges that he has right now, like, first of all, this nonprofit looks dumb because they'll just look dumb. But secondly, there's a monetary issue because the money that they're raising should be used for a good cause to actually help people. So her wanting to reverse her behavior and deny accountability and get us to where we are today took money away from someone else, took time and resources away from someone else. And that sucks. And I'm sure there's no consequences for it. I mean, they'll just keep saying she's still a victim no matter what happens. And then, yep. So, Shahid says she bought drugs at that Rolly. She went with all her friends back to 2023 Glastonbury. She's like, no, I'm still good. Even though I'm single now and have to fend for myself, I still have money somehow. But yeah, they got played for sure. And then don't forget, she had that victims fund thing, right? Yeah, she collected her redundancy pay in lieu, and then she claimed that $700 in like toiletry and clothing, even though she had no ripped clothing and no stolen objects. So probably got some Ambien to help her sleep. All right, so let's wrap up this motion to set aside the verdict. Again, guys, if you think anything is important that a bystander should be able to know quickly, instead of watching a whole 2-hour video, if when this closes out you want to leave a static comment on the video outside of the live chat, go ahead and just point out one thing that you think a reader passing by this video should know. That's always helpful to get certain information out here. I'm going to schedule another video to do the 15-page motion to keep everything sealed. So look for that to be scheduled. I'm just going to go eat something, get some caffeine, drink something, so maybe have a cough drop, and we'll get back together. What are we calling this now? The Jonathan Majors Town Hall? So we'll do that. And Daisy, if you ever want to come up on a stream, because you're the one doing this research for this motion and then for the play, you always have an open invite. Just let me know if you'd be willing to do that, and I'll send you a StreamYard link. You guys all look for a notification and take care for like the next hour till we meet again. Bye, guys.